Everything experts swore was settled began unraveling overnight. A skull with impossible features, a vanished expedition, encrypted symbols nobody could decode, and records that seemed deliberately altered ignited decades of turmoil. Each discovery raised darker questions than answers. Then investigators uncovered something so unsettling, disbelief became unavoidable for everyone. The shoreline is quiet now. Along the rugged northern edge of Newfoundland, waves roll steadily against rocky coves, and cold winds sweep across grassy headlands. In summer, the landscape is green and open beneath long northern days. In winter, it becomes a world of ice, fog, and darkness. It was here, at a place known today as Lons Au Meadows, that archaeologists uncovered evidence of something once thought impossible. A Norse settlement in North America, established nearly 5 centuries before Columbus reached the Caribbean. The discovery transformed historical understanding. Excavations beginning in the 1960s revealed the remains of turf-walled structures, ironworking facilities, and unmistakable Norse artifacts. Scientific dating confirmed that Scandinavian voyagers had crossed the Atlantic around the year 1000. The settlement appeared to match descriptions found in medieval Icelandic sagas, stories recounting voyages to a distant land called Vinland. Yet even as one mystery was solved, another emerged. If the Norse had successfully reached North America, what became of their colony? The sagas describe expeditions led by explorers such as Leif Erikson and later settlers who attempted to establish a more permanent presence. They speak of forests rich in timber, rivers filled with fish, and resources unavailable in Greenland. Compared to the harsh conditions of the North Atlantic settlements, Vinland seemed promising. And yet the colony vanished. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Norse occupation at Lons Au Meadows was relatively brief. There are signs of activity, repairs, and organized work, but little indication that a large, thriving community remained there for generations. At some point, the settlement was abandoned. Why? The most widely accepted explanations are practical. The voyage from Greenland was long and dangerous. Maintaining supply lines across vast stretches of ocean would have required significant resources. The Norse colonies in Greenland themselves faced challenges, including limited agricultural capacity and fluctuating climate conditions. A distant outpost may simply have been too difficult to sustain. Another possibility involves conflict. The sagas refer to encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings. These accounts describe periods of trade but also episodes of violence and tension. Historians caution that the sagas were written centuries after the events they describe, blending memory, oral tradition, and literary storytelling. Nevertheless, they raise an important question. Did repeated clashes make long-term settlement impossible? If so, what exactly happened during those encounters? The archaeological record remains frustratingly silent. No battlefield has been found. No dramatic evidence of destruction has emerged. Instead, there is only the absence left behind by departure. Yet some researchers have wondered whether Lons Au Meadows was never intended to be a full colony at all. Perhaps it functioned as a seasonal base, a staging point for exploration farther south. If that is true, then the true heart of Vinland may still lie undiscovered somewhere along the Atlantic coast. This possibility has inspired decades of searching. Fragments of evidence occasionally surface, unusual artifacts, debated archaeological sites, and hints that Norse travelers may have ventured far beyond Newfoundland. Most claims remain controversial. Some have been challenged by later analysis. Others continue to provoke discussion among specialists. Then there are the more speculative theories. A few writers have proposed that small groups of Norse settlers integrated with indigenous communities and gradually disappeared into local populations. Others suggest undiscovered settlements may still exist beneath forests, fields, or coastal sediments. There are even theories that references in the sagas point toward journeys much farther south than traditionally believed. None of these ideas has achieved broad acceptance, yet neither have they been completely erased from the conversation. The challenge lies in the nature of the evidence itself. Archaeology rarely provides complete stories. It offers fragments, pieces of structures, scattered tools, traces of fires long extinguished. Between those fragments, uncertainty remains. And Vinland exists precisely within that uncertainty. The confirmed facts are remarkable enough. Norse sailors crossed the Atlantic, established a foothold in North America, and left traces that survived for 1,000 years. But the deeper story, the fate of the people who lived there, the extent of their journeys, and the reasons they ultimately departed, remains elusive. Standing on those windswept shores today, it is difficult not to wonder what once unfolded beyond the edge of recorded history. Did the settlers leave willingly, recognizing an unsustainable venture? Were they driven away by circumstances now forgotten? Or does some missing piece of the story still lie hidden beneath the northern landscape waiting for discovery? For now, the silence of Vinland keeps its secrets. If the fate of Vinland reminds us how entire communities can fade into silence, the next mystery takes us from the windswept shores of the North Atlantic to the heart of a medieval empire, where the disappearance of a single man would leave questions that have endured for more than 1,000 years. The city sleeps beneath a veil of amber light. Minarets rise above crowded streets. Ancient walls cast long shadows across narrow alleys. Beyond the bustle of markets and palaces, the rocky hills overlooking Cairo stretch toward the horizon, quiet and almost unchanged despite the passing centuries. It was among these hills, on a cool February night in the year 1021, that one of history's most enigmatic rulers vanished without explanation. His name was Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah. As the sixth caliph of the Fatimid dynasty, Al-Hakim ruled a vast realm that stretched across much of North Africa and parts of the eastern Mediterranean. His reign was remarkable, controversial, and often difficult to understand. Contemporary chroniclers described a ruler capable of both generosity and severity, intellectual curiosity and sudden unpredictability. Yet despite the extensive records surrounding his life, it is his disappearance that continues to fascinate historians. The known facts are surprisingly simple. On the evening of February 13, 1021, Al-Hakim left Cairo for one of his customary nighttime rides. Such excursions were not unusual. He often traveled with minimal escort, preferring solitude as he wandered the hills east of the city. This time, however, he never returned. Search parties were dispatched. Officials combed the surrounding landscape. Eventually, investigators discovered his donkey and blood-stained garments. The caliph himself was nowhere to be found. No body was recovered. The absence of physical remains transformed what might have been a tragic death into a mystery that would echo through the centuries. The most widely accepted explanation is assassination. Al-Hakim had accumulated numerous political enemies during his reign. Like many powerful rulers, he governed a court filled with rival factions, ambitious officials, and individuals whose fortunes rose and fell according to his favor. Some historians suspect that members of the Fatimid elite orchestrated his murder, eliminating a ruler whose behavior had become increasingly difficult to predict. Suspicion has often centered on his sister, Sitt al-Mulk. A highly influential figure within the Fatimid court, she emerged as a key political force following her brother's disappearance. Some medieval sources hinted that she may have played a role in a conspiracy against him. Yet the evidence remains frustratingly indirect. Many accounts were written years later, shaped by political agendas and personal biases. Was she truly involved? Or did later generations simply seek a convenient explanation? Other theories focus on external enemies. The Fatimid Caliphate faced numerous challenges from competing powers, rebellious groups, and regional rivals. Could agents operating beyond the palace walls have intercepted the caliph during his solitary ride? If so, why was no definitive evidence ever uncovered? The questions multiply as the trail grows colder. Yet the mystery takes an even more unusual turn. Among followers of the faith that would later become known as the Druze religion, Al-Hakim occupies a unique and deeply significant place. Some believers came to view him as far more than a political ruler. Following his disappearance, traditions emerged suggesting that he had not died at all. Instead, it was said that he had entered a state of concealment. According to these beliefs, Al-Hakim would one day return, his absence forming part of a larger divine plan beyond ordinary human understanding. From a historical perspective, such traditions cannot be verified. Yet they illustrate how profoundly his disappearance affected those who lived through the event. When a body is never found, certainty becomes difficult. The line between history and belief begins to blur. Over the centuries, additional speculation emerged. Some writers suggested that Al-Hakim staged his own disappearance, abandoning power intentionally. Others imagined secret imprisonment, hidden exile, or clandestine escape. These possibilities remain largely unsupported by evidence, yet they continue to appear whenever discussions of the mystery arise. What makes the case so compelling is not merely the disappearance itself, but the unusual combination of circumstances surrounding it. A ruler at the height of his authority vanishes during a routine journey. Personal belongings are recovered. Blood is found. Yet the central piece of evidence, the man himself, never reappears. Even today, historians examining medieval chronicles encounter the same obstacle faced by investigators a millennium ago. A story filled with clues, but lacking a final answer. Somewhere among the surviving texts, political rivalries, religious traditions, and fragmentary records may lie the truth of what happened that night outside Cairo. Or perhaps the crucial detail disappeared along with the caliph himself. As darkness settles over those ancient hills, one question remains suspended between history and legend. Did Al-Hakim perish at the hands of his enemies, or did his disappearance conceal a reality that has yet to be uncovered? If the mystery of Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah centers on a ruler who vanished without a trace, the next case concerns a king whose death was witnessed by many, yet remains strangely uncertain. Sometimes a missing body creates questions. At other times, it is the official explanation itself that refuses to satisfy. The forest is quiet beneath a canopy of ancient oaks. Sunlight filters through branches, casting shifting patterns across the undergrowth. Deer move cautiously between shadows. Birds call from unseen perches. Today, the landscape known as the New Forest in southern England appears peaceful. But on a summer afternoon in the year 1100, it became the setting for one of medieval Europe's most enduring mysteries. A king entered these woods alive. By sunset, he was dead. The man was William II of England, often known as William Rufus because of his ruddy complexion. The son of William the Conqueror, he had ruled England for 13 years. Strong-willed, politically skilled, and frequently controversial, William II commanded both loyalty and resentment among nobles, clergy, and rivals alike. On August 2nd, 1100, he joined a hunting party in the New Forest. Hunting was more than recreation for medieval kings. It was a display of status, authority, and martial skill. Noblemen frequently gathered in royal forests to pursue deer and other game, often carrying powerful bows capable of inflicting devastating injuries. According to the traditional account, the king's death was a tragic accident. As the hunt progressed, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell allegedly loosed an arrow at a deer. The projectile missed its intended target, struck a tree, ricocheted, and fatally wounded the king in the chest. William collapsed and died almost immediately. At first glance, the explanation seems straightforward. Hunting accidents were not uncommon during the Middle Ages. Powerful bows, crowded hunting grounds, and rapidly moving targets created dangerous conditions. Contemporary chroniclers recorded numerous injuries and deaths resulting from similar circumstances. Yet the details surrounding William's death quickly raised suspicions. One of the most striking facts concerns what happened afterward. Instead of remaining to assist or investigate, many members of the hunting party reportedly fled the scene. Walter Tyrrell himself left England soon after the incident. Meanwhile, William's younger brother Henry moved with remarkable speed. Within days, Henry secured control of the royal treasury and positioned himself to claim the English throne. The sequence of events was efficient, perhaps too efficient. Was Henry simply acting decisively during a moment of political uncertainty? Or had preparations already been made? Historians have debated these questions for centuries. The political context certainly provides fertile ground for speculation. Medieval succession was rarely secure. Rival claims, shifting alliances, and ambitions within the royal family often created instability. William had no legitimate children. His death immediately transformed the balance of power throughout England and Normandy. Those circumstances have led some researchers to consider the possibility of assassination. Could the fatal arrow have been intentional rather than accidental? Supporters of this theory point to Henry's rapid accession and the unusual behavior of those present during the hunt. They argue that the official explanation may have served as a convenient cover for a carefully planned act. Yet the evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. No surviving document directly proves a conspiracy. No confession exists. No contemporary investigation established murder. Most accounts were written by chroniclers whose narratives were shaped by politics, religious perspectives, and personal loyalties. Some writers have even noted the symbolic significance of the location itself. The New Forest carried a reputation for misfortune within Norman royal history. Several members of the royal family had died there under unusual circumstances. Medieval observers often interpreted such events through a spiritual lens, viewing them as divine judgment or signs of supernatural displeasure. To modern historians, these interpretations reveal more about medieval beliefs than historical reality. Nevertheless, they contributed to the growing aura surrounding William's death. As centuries passed, the mystery acquired an almost legendary quality. Every unexplained detail became another thread in a larger tapestry of uncertainty. Why did witnesses disperse so quickly? Why were records so limited? Why did the official narrative leave so many lingering doubts? Even the physical evidence offers little help. The forest has changed. The precise location remains debated. The arrow itself is long gone. What remains are chronicles, fragments of testimony, and a sequence of events that can be interpreted in multiple ways. Perhaps William II truly died in a tragic hunting accident, the victim of chance and misfortune. Perhaps political ambition transformed an accident into an opportunity. Or perhaps the forests of medieval England concealed a darker secret that never reached the written record. Today, the New Forest still stands, its winding paths crossing landscapes little changed from the King's era. Visitors walk beneath trees that whisper in the wind, much as they did 9 centuries ago. And somewhere within that silence lingers a question historians continue to ask. Was William Rufus killed by an errant arrow, or was his death one of the most successful political murders in medieval history? If the mystery of William Rufus revolves around a death witnessed yet never fully explained, the next case presents a different kind of uncertainty. There was no sudden fatal arrow, no dramatic scene in a forest clearing. Instead, an entire community slowly faded from history, leaving behind abandoned homes, silent churches, and a question that still echoes across the Arctic. The fjord is still. Dark mountains rise from icy waters, their slopes streaked with snow even during the brief northern summer. The wind carries the scent of salt and stone. Along the shoreline lie the remnants of old farms, collapsed walls, weathered foundations, and fragments of a world that once seemed permanent. Today, these ruins stand in the remote reaches of Greenland. Centuries ago, they formed part of one of the most isolated European communities on Earth. The story begins in the late 10th century, when Norse settlers established colonies along Greenland's southwestern coast. Led by pioneers from Iceland and Scandinavia, these settlers created two principal regions of habitation: the Eastern Settlement and the smaller Western Settlement. For generations, life endured in this harsh environment. Families raised livestock, built churches, traded valuable walrus ivory, and maintained connections with the wider medieval world. Despite immense challenges, the settlements survived for centuries at the edge of the known world. Then something happened. The Western Settlement vanished. Unlike many historical mysteries, we possess a rough timeline. By the 14th century, references to the Western Settlement become increasingly scarce. One of the most frequently cited accounts comes from a priest named Ivar Bardarsson, who traveled through Greenland during the 1300s. According to later reports attributed to him, the Western Settlement was already abandoned when he arrived. The farms were empty. The inhabitants were gone. No detailed explanation accompanied their disappearance. This absence of evidence has fueled centuries of debate. The most widely accepted explanation involves environmental change. During the period often associated with the Little Ice Age, temperatures in the North Atlantic gradually declined. Growing seasons shortened. Sea ice became more extensive. Travel and trade grew increasingly difficult. For communities already living near the limits of agricultural viability, even modest climatic shifts could have serious consequences. Did worsening conditions simply force the settlers to leave? Archaeological evidence suggests that life became increasingly difficult during the colony's final centuries. Animal remains indicate changing dietary patterns. Resources may have become scarcer. Trade with Europe appears to have declined, reducing access to goods that Greenlanders depended upon. Yet climate alone may not tell the entire story. Another possibility involves migration. Perhaps the inhabitants did not perish at all. Faced with mounting challenges, they may have relocated to the larger Eastern Settlement or returned to Iceland and Scandinavia. Such a decision would have been difficult, but not impossible. The problem is that historical records offer little confirmation. The people disappear from the documentary record almost as completely as they disappear from the landscape itself. Relations with the Inuit population have also attracted considerable attention. By the time of the Western Settlement's decline, Inuit groups occupied parts of Greenland and possessed remarkable expertise in Arctic survival. Some medieval sources hint at encounters between Norse settlers and Inuit communities. Whether those interactions were peaceful, hostile, or a combination of both remains uncertain. Could conflict have contributed to the settlement's disappearance? A few historical accounts suggest this possibility, but the evidence remains limited. Archaeological findings have not revealed clear proof of widespread violence. Instead, researchers often find signs of gradual decline rather than sudden catastrophe. Still, unanswered questions remain. Then there are the more speculative theories. Some writers have imagined devastating epidemics, although direct evidence is lacking. Others have proposed starvation, piracy, or attacks by unknown raiders. A handful of fringe theories even suggest that undocumented voyages carried survivors to distant lands. These ideas capture the imagination, but none have gained broad acceptance among historians. What makes the mystery particularly compelling is the nature of the archaeological record. When excavating abandoned Norse farms, researchers often encounter evidence of orderly departure rather than panic. Buildings deteriorated over time, livestock disappeared, daily life simply ceased. It is as though an entire society quietly stepped away from the landscape. But where did they go? And why did they leave so little trace of their final decision? The silence becomes even more striking when viewed against the broader history of Norse expansion. These were descendants of the same seafaring culture that crossed vast oceans, settled Iceland, colonized Greenland, and reached North America centuries before Columbus. Their achievements were extraordinary, yet one of their communities vanished with scarcely a written explanation. Today, the ruins remain exposed to Arctic winds. Grass grows over ancient foundations. Snow drifts across abandoned churchyards. The fjords reflect the same mountains that Norse settlers once gazed upon generations ago. Somewhere within those scattered stones may lie clues that have yet to be recognized, evidence capable of revealing whether the Western settlement succumbed to climate, migration, conflict, or a combination of forces too complex to reconstruct. Until then, the empty farms of Greenland continue to pose a quiet but enduring question. How can an entire community survive for centuries at the edge of the world, only to disappear so completely that history can no longer explain its final chapter? If the silence of the Greenland Western settlement speaks of disappearance on a slow environmental scale, the next mystery turns again to the open sea, where Norse ships pushed beyond known horizons, and where even the most carefully preserved stories begin to blur into uncertainty. The ocean is endless here. Cold Atlantic swells roll beneath a pale northern sky, stretching toward a horizon that seems to erase distance itself. Somewhere between Iceland and Greenland, the same waters once carried wooden ships guided by stars, wind, and memory. These were the roots of a seafaring world that pushed outward long before modern navigation could chart its paths with certainty. It is within this maritime world that the figure of Leif Erikson emerges. According to the medieval sagas, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, was among the first Europeans to reach lands west of Greenland around the year 1000 BC. These texts describe a coastline rich with timber, wild grapes, and fertile ground, a place later called Vinland. Archaeological evidence at Lance aux Meadows supports the reality of Norse presence in North America, confirming that such voyages did indeed occur. But the sagas hint at something more. Vinland, as described in these accounts, was not the final destination. It was a beginning. After the initial contact with North America, the narratives become less precise. They speak of further expeditions, shifting leadership, and attempts to establish more permanent settlements. Yet the details grow fragmented. Names change, routes diverge, distances become symbolic rather than measurable. Did Leif Erikson himself travel beyond Vinland? The traditional interpretation suggests that his voyages were limited to reconnaissance and exploration, after which he returned to Greenland and later Norway. In this view, he served as a pathfinder rather than a colonizer, mapping possibilities rather than building enduring settlements. But not all interpretations end there. Some historians have noted hints within the sagas that suggest repeated voyages deeper into the continent. These passages, often ambiguous, describe lands of dense forests and unfamiliar resources, regions that do not neatly align with the archaeological footprint at Lance aux Meadows. Could these descriptions reflect journeys farther south along the Atlantic coast? If so, where would those voyages have led? The challenge lies in separating narrative tradition from historical fact. The sagas were written centuries after the events they describe, shaped by oral transmission, literary embellishment, and the worldview of medieval Icelandic society. They preserve memory, but not always in a linear or literal form. Still, maritime archaeology leaves room for speculation. The North Atlantic currents are powerful and unpredictable. Storms could have carried ships far off course. Skilled navigators might have followed coastlines for days or weeks without making landfall. If Norse vessels reached multiple points along the eastern edge of North America, their traces may remain scattered, indistinct, or yet undiscovered. What would such traces look like? A tool fragment in an unexpected layer of sediment, a temporary shelter overlooked by earlier surveys, a genetic or linguistic imprint too subtle to identify without modern analysis. Each possibility exists at the edge of what archaeology can confirm, yet none has been definitively proven. There are also the broader questions of intent. Were these voyages systematic attempts at expansion, or isolated explorations driven by curiosity and opportunity? Some scholars argue that Vinland expeditions were experimental, testing the limits of navigation and settlement. Others suggest a more ambitious vision, one that may have extended farther than surviving records reveal. Then there is the question of loss. If further settlements were established beyond Vinland, what became of them? The disappearance of the Greenland Western settlement shows how quickly isolated communities can fade when conditions shift. Could similar outcomes have occurred elsewhere, leaving no surviving records or recognizable archaeological signatures? Fringe theories occasionally extend these possibilities even further, suggesting that Norse explorers may have reached more distant regions of the continent. These ideas remain highly speculative and lack concrete evidence, but they persist in cultural imagination, fueled by the gaps in the historical record. What remains undeniable is the achievement itself. Norse sailors crossed one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the medieval world, reaching lands previously unknown to Europe centuries before transatlantic voyages became commonplace. They navigated without compasses, charts in the modern sense, or reliable weather forecasting. Their journeys were shaped by observation, experience, and tradition passed from ship to ship. And yet, despite this remarkable capability, their story becomes increasingly fragmented the further it extends from Greenland. Vinland is confirmed. Lonso Meadows stands as evidence. But beyond that point, the map dissolves into uncertainty. Standing on the edge of the North Atlantic today, it is difficult not to imagine those ships pressing westward into open water, their sails catching winds that carried them toward unknown shores. Whether they reached further lands or turned back at the limits of endurance remains unresolved. Somewhere beyond Vinland, beyond the limits of confirmed history, the sea still holds its silence, and the question lingers quietly across the waves. How far did Leif Erikson's world truly extend, and what traces of those final horizons might still lie hidden beneath time and tide? If the Norse voyages fade into uncertainty at the edge of the Atlantic, the next mystery turns inward, away from open water and toward fire, forge, and metal. Here, in the heat of ancient workshops, a different kind of enigma was born, one not carried by ships, but shaped in flame and steel. The blade rests in silence. Even now, after centuries, surviving examples of Damascus steel catch the light in a way that feels almost unnatural. Their surfaces ripple with flowing patterns, dark and bright waves that seem to move as the object is turned. In museums and private collections, these weapons appear less like forged tools and more like captured motion, frozen within metal. For centuries, such blades were prized across the medieval world. They were said to be extraordinarily sharp, remarkably resilient, and capable of holding an edge far longer than ordinary steel. Crusaders spoke of swords that could cut through lesser weapons, silk scarves, even layered armor with unsettling ease. Whether fully accurate or partially exaggerated through legend, these accounts contributed to the growing mystique of what came to be known as Damascus steel. The name itself is tied to the ancient city of Damascus, a major center of trade and craftsmanship in the medieval Near East. Yet the true origin of the technique is more complex, likely involving a broader network of smithing traditions across regions influenced by early Islamic metallurgy. What is certain is that the production method was eventually lost. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European and Middle Eastern smiths attempting to replicate the original blades found themselves unable to reproduce their distinctive qualities. The knowledge that once shaped some of the most sought-after weapons in history had seemingly vanished. Why? The most widely accepted explanation lies in the material itself. Historical analysis suggests that original Damascus blades were made using crucible steel, often associated with high-carbon ingots known as Wootz steel. These ingots, produced in parts of India and Sri Lanka, were then traded across the medieval world and reworked by skilled smiths in the Middle East. Under precise heating, cooling, and forging conditions, this steel developed microscopic structures that created its signature patterns and mechanical properties. But even with modern metallurgical understanding, questions remain. Why did the precise combination of techniques, temperature control, and material sourcing disappear? And why did later attempts fail to reproduce the same consistency? Some historians suggest that the loss was gradual rather than sudden. Trade disruptions, shifting political landscapes, and changes in industrial practices may have broken the chain of knowledge between generations of craftsmen. In such a system, where expertise was often transmitted orally or through apprenticeship, even small interruptions could result in irreversible loss. Yet the mystery deepens when examining surviving blades. Microscopic studies have revealed structures within some Damascus steel that appear unusually refined for the technological capabilities of the period. Carbon nanotube-like formations have been observed in certain samples, though their interpretation remains debated. Are these features the result of advanced ancient techniques, or simply natural outcomes of repeated forging under specific conditions? The scientific community has not reached consensus. Alongside mainstream explanations, more speculative theories have emerged. Some propose that the secret lay not only in technique, but in a now lost source of ore with unique impurities that could not be easily replicated. Others suggest that environmental factors, such as precise fuel composition or atmospheric conditions in ancient workshops, played a crucial role. There are even more imaginative ideas, though far less accepted, which suggest that knowledge of the process may have been deliberately restricted or encoded within tightly guarded guild traditions, eventually fading as those traditions dissolved. Yet no definitive record of such deliberate secrecy has survived. What remains instead are fragments, written descriptions from travelers, partial recipes recorded centuries after the fact, and blades preserved in silence, their surfaces still shimmering with patterns that defy easy explanation. In modern laboratories, metallurgists have come closer than ever to understanding the principles behind Damascus steel. Experimental recreations have produced impressive results, but none have fully captured the legendary combination of beauty, resilience, and unpredictability described in historical accounts. So the question persists. Was Damascus steel the product of a perfectly understood but later lost process? Or did its creation depend on a convergence of materials, environment, and human skill so specific that it could never be fully replicated once the original conditions disappeared? Standing before one of these ancient blades today, one is left with a quiet sense of continuity and distance at the same time. The object is present, tangible, measurable, and yet the knowledge behind it feels just out of reach, as if the past is still speaking, but in a language no longer fully understood. And somewhere between history and metallurgy, the mystery remains. What exactly was the final element that turned ordinary steel into something the world would struggle to recreate for centuries? If the secret of Damascus steel lies buried in lost techniques of fire and metal, the next mystery unfolds in a very different landscape, one shaped not by forges, but by earth, river, and stone. Here, the question is not how something was made, but how something so vast and powerful simply came undone. The mound rises from the plains like a memory that refuses to fade. Along the floodplain of the Mississippi River in what is now the American Midwest, earthworks still mark the outline of a once great city. grass-covered mounds stretch across the horizon in quiet geometries, their forms softened by time but still unmistakably human in design. This is the archaeological heart of Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian urban center north of Mesoamerica. At its height, around 1050 to 1200 AD, Cahokia was unlike anything in its region. Estimates suggest a population that may have reached tens of thousands, supported by agriculture, trade networks, and complex social organization. At the center stood monumental earthworks, including Monk's Mound, an immense platform structure that still dominates the landscape today. From its summit, one could once look across a sprawling city of wooden architecture, plazas, and ceremonial spaces. Then, gradually, it changed. By the 14th century, Cahokia was largely abandoned. The reasons behind this decline remain one of North American archaeology's most enduring questions. The most widely accepted explanations point toward environmental and social pressures. Intensive agriculture may have strained local resources, leading to deforestation and soil depletion. As the population grew, sustaining large-scale maize cultivation in a changing environment would have become increasingly difficult. Evidence from sediment cores and ecological studies suggests shifts in climate patterns during this period. Variations in rainfall and temperature could have disrupted harvests, creating cycles of scarcity and stress. In a city dependent on agricultural surplus, even moderate instability might have had profound consequences. But environmental change alone does not fully explain the scale or suddenness of Cahokia's decline. Archaeological evidence also points to signs of internal social tension. Some excavations reveal structures interpreted by researchers as possible mass graves or ritualized burial sites, suggesting episodes of violence or upheaval. Defensive palisades appear in later phases of occupation, hinting at increasing concern over security. Was Cahokia experiencing internal fragmentation? Or were external pressures also at play? The region was not isolated. Cahokia existed within a broader network of Mississippian cultures, connected through trade and shared traditions. Shifts in these relationships could have altered the balance of power, disrupting the economic and political systems that supported urban life. Some scholars suggest that leadership changes or political instability may have weakened cohesion within the city itself. In societies where authority was closely tied to ceremonial and agricultural cycles, disruptions to either could ripple through the entire system. Yet, even these explanations leave gaps. There is no clear record of conquest. No single catastrophic event has been identified in the archaeological record. Instead, Cahokia appears to have declined gradually, with population dispersal occurring over generations rather than in a sudden collapse. This gradual disappearance has led to alternative interpretations. Some researchers have proposed that the population may have migrated intentionally, dispersing into smaller communities across the region. In this view, Cahokia did not fall in a dramatic sense, but was gradually transformed as its inhabitants adapted to changing conditions. Others point to cultural and spiritual factors. Cahokia was not only a city, but a ceremonial landscape, deeply tied to cosmological beliefs. Changes in ritual practices, leadership legitimacy, or religious interpretation may have influenced decisions to leave or reorganize settlement patterns. And then there are more speculative theories. A few suggest that disease, possibly introduced through long-distance contact networks, may have contributed to population decline, though direct evidence remains limited. Others have proposed social collapse driven by inequality or elite competition, where internal divisions gradually undermined the stability of the city. None of these ideas fully resolves the mystery on its own. What remains striking is not only that Cahokia was abandoned, but that it was never reoccupied in the same form. The mounds endured. The land remained fertile. The river continued its course. Yet the urban system that once dominated the region never returned. Walking among the surviving earthworks today, it is difficult to imagine the scale of what once stood here. The silence is expansive, broken only by wind moving through grass and distant birds crossing open sky. The geometry of the mounds suggests intention, planning, and sustained effort across generations, effort that eventually came to an end without a clearly defined conclusion. So the question remains suspended over the landscape. Did Cahokia decline because of environmental stress, political transformation, cultural migration, or a combination of forces too complex to untangle from the archaeological record? Or does the truth still lie partially hidden beneath the soil, waiting for evidence that has yet to be uncovered? If the silence of Cahokia lingers across the plains like an unanswered question carved into earth, the next mystery shifts us back across the Atlantic, into cold northern landscapes where stone, sea, and memory intertwine. Here, history does not vanish in ruins alone, but in the absence of something once expected to remain, a royal resting place that has never been found. The fjord is quiet beneath winter light. Along the coasts of modern Denmark, where wind moves freely across marsh and coastline, the land holds traces of an age when emerging kingdoms were still defining themselves through conquest, faith, and monument. Wooden halls once rose here, followed by early stone churches that marked a shifting era in Scandinavian history. It is within this world that Harald Bluetooth emerges as a central figure. A ruler associated with the unification of Denmark and the spread of Christianity, Harald Bluetooth's reign in the 10th century BC is documented through both written sources and monumental inscriptions, most famously the Jelling stones. These carved runestones, still standing in modern Denmark, describe a king who made the Danes Christian and unified large regions under his authority. Yet despite his historical significance, one of the most enduring questions surrounding him is not how he ruled, but where he rests. Harald Bluetooth is believed to have died around 985 BC after a conflict with his son, Sweyn Forkbeard, which ultimately led to his exile. According to medieval accounts, he was wounded during this power struggle and fled across the Baltic region, possibly seeking refuge among allies or distant territories influenced by his reign. After that, the historical trail grows uncertain. No confirmed burial site has ever been identified. This absence stands in contrast to other rulers of his era, whose graves, whether monumental or modest, often leave at least some archaeological trace. Harald, however, appears to have left behind influence, inscriptions, and legend, but no verifiable tomb. The most widely accepted explanation is surprisingly simple. He may have been buried in an unmarked or lost grave, either due to the circumstances of exile or the political instability surrounding his final years. In times of conflict, even kings could be denied formal burial rites, their remains placed in hidden or undocumented locations. But the mystery does not end there. Some historians have pointed to the possibility that Harald died far from the political centers of his power, in regions where record-keeping was limited or later destroyed. If so, his burial may lie somewhere outside traditional Danish archaeological zones, perhaps in areas influenced by shifting alliances during the late Viking Age. Yet no confirmed discovery has emerged. No inscription, no burial mound, no definitive artifact. This absence has led to further speculation. Could Harald's remains have been deliberately concealed to prevent political symbolism from forming around his grave? In early medieval societies, burial sites often carried powerful ideological weight, reinforcing claims of legitimacy and continuity. If rival factions sought to erase or control his legacy, hiding or obscuring his burial would have been a powerful act. Other theories explore more uncertain ground. Some suggest that his body may have been moved posthumously, either for reburial in a safer or more politically favorable location, or lost during periods of upheaval that followed his death. Others propose that his grave may still exist, buried beneath layers of later construction, waiting to be discovered beneath modern settlements or agricultural land. A few even propose that the tomb was never meant to be monumental at all, that Harald, in exile and defeat, may have been buried without ceremony, his resting place intentionally forgotten in the shifting tides of power that followed his fall. Yet even these ideas do not close the question. Archaeology in Scandinavia has uncovered vast burial landscapes from the Viking Age, ship burials, stone settings, and monumental mounds that speak to a culture deeply engaged with memory and the afterlife. Against this backdrop, the absence of Harald Bluetooth's tomb feels even more striking. How does a king remembered for unification, conversion, and political transformation leave behind no confirmed resting place? Modern technology continues to refine searches across Denmark and surrounding regions. Ground-penetrating radar, landscape archaeology, and re-examination of medieval texts have all been applied to the problem. Still, nothing definitive has emerged. The land remains quiet on this question. Stone churches stand where early Christian influence once spread. Fields stretch across landscapes once shaped by competing rulers. And somewhere beneath these layers of history, a missing grave continues to elude discovery. Perhaps the tomb was never meant to be monumental. Perhaps it lies hidden beneath a site not yet examined. Or perhaps its absence itself reflects the instability of the era, when even kings could disappear into the uncertainties of transition between old beliefs and new faith. As the wind moves across the Danish coast, carrying with it the same cold air that once swept through Harald's final years, the question remains suspended between archaeology and legend. Where does a king go when even his resting place vanishes from history? If the missing tomb of Harald Bluetooth leaves us searching for a body that never fully anchored itself in history, the next mystery shifts from stone and burial earth to something even more fragile: knowledge itself. Because sometimes what disappears is not a person, but an entire intellectual world, erased so completely that only echoes remain. The city rises from the desert heat like a mirage. Within the layered streets of medieval Cairo, sunlight reflects off limestone walls and wooden latticework, while narrow alleys carry the sounds of merchants, scholars, and travelers moving through one of the most intellectually vibrant cities of its time. It was here, during the reign of Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, that a remarkable institution is said to have existed, one that later became entangled in uncertainty, memory, and loss. A library, or perhaps something more. Historical sources describe a vast repository of knowledge associated with the Fatimid court in Cairo, often linked to what later traditions called the House of Knowledge or House of Wisdom, like institutions. Manuscripts, scientific treatises, philosophical works, and religious texts were reportedly gathered, studied, and preserved under royal patronage. In an era when books were rare and painstakingly copied by hand, such a collection would have represented an extraordinary concentration of human thought. Yet when historians attempt to reconstruct its full scale and fate, the picture becomes unclear. Unlike later institutions whose records survived in more continuous form, references to Al-Hakim's library are fragmented, scattered across chronicles, administrative documents, and later historical interpretations written centuries after the Fatimid period. Some accounts describe vast halls filled with thousands upon thousands of volumes. Others are more restrained, suggesting a smaller but highly specialized collection maintained for scholarly and political purposes. So, what exactly was lost? The most widely accepted explanation is that the library suffered during periods of political upheaval following the decline of Fatimid power. As dynasties shifted and control of Cairo changed hands, institutions tied closely to previous regimes often faced neglect, repurposing, or destruction. In such transitions, books could be dispersed, repurposed, or simply allowed to decay. Paper and parchment are not immune to time. Fire, moisture, and neglect can erase entire archives within decades if not carefully preserved. Some historians suggest that portions of the collection may have been integrated into later libraries, their origins gradually forgotten as manuscripts were recopied and redistributed across the medieval Islamic world. But the uncertainty remains. No complete catalog survives. No definitive inventory has been recovered. And no archaeological discovery has yet confirmed the precise location, structure, or final fate of Al-Hakim's library. This absence has given rise to deeper questions. Could portions of the library have been deliberately destroyed during political or religious conflicts? Medieval Cairo was not a static environment. It was shaped by shifting theological debates, power struggles, and changes in ruling authority. In such contexts, libraries could become both treasures and targets, preserved by some, dismantled by others. Some narratives suggest that ideological tensions may have influenced what survived. Texts deemed incompatible with later interpretations of doctrine might have been removed or suppressed. Others may have been copied elsewhere, their original context lost in the process of transmission. And then there are more speculative ideas. A few traditions and later romanticized accounts propose that parts of the collection were hidden rather than destroyed, relocated to private archives, dispersed among scholars, or absorbed into other great centers of learning in the medieval world. While these theories lack direct archaeological confirmation, they persist in cultural memory, reflecting the sense that something vast once existed and then quietly dissolved. Yet even these possibilities do not fully explain the silence. If a library of extraordinary scope once stood in Cairo under Al-Hakim's patronage, why does its footprint in the archaeological record remain so faint? Why do surviving references feel like reflections seen in disturbed water, recognizable but incomplete? Modern scholarship continua. Perhaps it was never a single unified structure, but rather a network of collections spread across palaces and institutions. Perhaps it was absorbed so completely into later traditions that its identity dissolved. Or perhaps some ways to piece together fragments of Fatimid intellectual life through surviving manuscripts, architectural remains, and comparative historical analysis. What emerges is a picture of a sophisticated society deeply engaged with science, philosophy, medicine, and theology. And yet the library itself remains elusive. Perhaps it was never a single unified structure, but rather a network of collections spread across palaces and institutions. Perhaps it was absorbed so completely into later traditions that its identity dissolved. Or perhaps, somewhere beneath the layers of Cairo's long history, remnants still exist, waiting, unrecognized, beneath modern streets and buildings. Standing in the present-day city, where ancient and modern layers overlap in continuous motion, it is difficult not to imagine shelves that once held the accumulated thought of generations, now gone or transformed beyond recognition. And so the question remains suspended in time. Did the library of Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah truly vanish? Or has it simply been hidden within the flow of history, its pages scattered so widely that we no longer recognize them as part of a single lost world? If the lost library of Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah reminds us how knowledge can vanish into silence, the next mystery turns from books to bodies, from archives to armies, where entire forces moved across continents, only to fragment, dissolve, or disappear from history in ways that remain difficult to fully reconstruct. The landscape of Anatolia is vast and unforgiving. Rolling highlands stretch beneath a wide sky, broken by river valleys and rocky ridges that once served as passageways between east and west. In the late 11th century, these lands became the crossing point for one of the most consequential movements in medieval history, the armies of the First Crusade. These were not single unified forces, but multiple contingents from different regions of Europe, each with its own leaders, motivations, and routes toward the eastern Mediterranean. Among them were large groups of pilgrims turned soldiers who marched under banners of faith, ambition, and survival. Their goal was Jerusalem, a distant city of immense religious significance, far beyond the familiar landscapes of Western Europe. Yet not all of these armies completed their journeys as recorded in later chronicles. Some simply disappear from the historical record. The most widely documented forces, such as those led by figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, eventually reached the eastern Mediterranean and played roles in the establishment of Crusader states. But alongside these better-known contingents were other groups, less organized, less documented, and in some cases only briefly mentioned before fading from surviving accounts. One of the earliest and most enigmatic episodes is often associated with the so-called People's Crusade of 1096. Large numbers of poorly equipped pilgrims moved ahead of the main armies, traveling through the Balkans and into Anatolia with limited coordination and supplies. Contemporary accounts describe severe hardships, food shortages, unfamiliar terrain, and increasingly hostile encounters with local forces. Many of these groups were defeated or dispersed, but the details are uneven. In some cases, entire segments of these early movements vanish between one chronicle and the next. A group is recorded crossing a region, but no clear account explains what happened afterward. Did they perish in conflict? Were they absorbed into local populations? Or did they fragment into smaller bands whose identities were lost over time? The uncertainty deepens when examining the logistics of medieval warfare. Armies were not always recorded as single, coherent entities. They often consisted of loosely connected retinues, mercenaries, pilgrims, and local recruits. Chroniclers focused on leaders and major battles, not necessarily on every subgroup or straggling contingent. As a result, historical visibility narrows dramatically beyond key events. This creates gaps in the narrative, and within those gaps, questions persist. Some historians suggest that environmental and logistical pressures alone could account for many disappearances. The terrain of Anatolia was harsh for large, under-provisioned groups unfamiliar with its geography. Disease, starvation, and attrition may have dissolved entire segments of forces long before they reached recorded battlefields. Yet there are moments where explanation feels incomplete. Certain medieval sources hint at groups that simply never reappear in later records, not as casualties, not as survivors, and not as returnees. They are present at the beginning of a journey and absent at its expected conclusion. What became of them? Alternative interpretations have emerged over centuries. Some propose that fragments of these armies were integrated into Byzantine or local military structures, losing their original identity in the process. Others suggest that small groups may have settled in regions along the route, either by necessity or circumstance, blending gradually into surrounding populations. There are also more speculative ideas, though far less supported by evidence, that imagine isolated bands continuing eastward beyond the main Crusader theaters, their movements eventually dissolving into undocumented frontier zones where historical record becomes thin. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the silence. What remains striking is not only the fate of individual soldiers, but the disappearance of collective memory around entire contingents. In medieval chronicling, absence is often as telling as presence, but it rarely provides closure. Even within the broader success of the First Crusade, which culminated in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 BC and the establishment of new political orders, these missing groups linger at the edges of history like unfinished sentences. Walking through the landscapes once traversed by these armies today, one sees villages, fields, and roads that have shifted countless times over the centuries. Yet beneath these modern layers lies the imprint of vast movements of people whose full stories were never completely recorded. So the question remains open: suspended between history and uncertainty. How many of the First Crusade's armies truly reached their destination, and how many were lost not only in battle, but in the quiet gaps of the historical record itself? If the fate of the First Crusade armies reveals how entire forces can fade into the gaps of medieval record-keeping, then the next mystery moves from people to objects, relics carried across continents, venerated in life, and then vanishing from history as if the very weight of their meaning could not prevent their disappearance. The stone walls of ancient cities still stand in parts of the Levant. In Jerusalem, layers of history overlap in silence. Roman foundations beneath medieval fortifications, Crusader-era chapels embedded within later reconstructions. Light falls differently here, as if filtered through centuries of contested memory. It was in this city, after the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 BC by forces of the First Crusade, that some of the most sacred objects of the medieval Christian world were said to have been gathered, displayed, and revered. Yet today, many of those relics no longer exist in any verifiable form. They are missing, and their disappearance remains one of the quieter, more elusive mysteries of the crusading era. When the Crusader armies entered Jerusalem, chroniclers describe scenes of profound religious intensity. Among the leaders of the expedition was Godfrey of Bouillon, who would become a central figure in the establishment of the Latin Christian presence in the city. The conquest of Jerusalem was not only a military turning point, but also a moment of immense symbolic accumulation, where sacred geography and sacred objects converged. Relics were central to medieval belief. Objects believed to be connected to Christ, saints, and early Christian history carried immense spiritual authority. They were not merely symbolic, they were considered tangible links between the earthly and the divine. Possession of such relics could elevate churches, legitimize rulers, and transform cities into pilgrimage destinations. After 1099 BC, Jerusalem became one of the most important repositories of such sacred objects in the Crusader world. But the historical record becomes uneven when tracing their fate. Some relics were clearly documented. Others appear briefly in chronicles and inventories before vanishing from later accounts. Over time, references thin out, and certainty gives way to fragmented mentions, often written decades or even centuries after the events they describe. What happened to them? The most straightforward explanation is loss through conflict and instability. The Crusader states existed in a precarious geopolitical environment, surrounded by shifting alliances, military campaigns, and periodic sieges. Churches were rebuilt, destroyed, or repurposed. Treasuries were moved repeatedly for protection. In such conditions, the physical preservation of fragile or portable objects was never guaranteed. Relics could be stolen, hidden, sold, or destroyed. And in a world where documentation was inconsistent, disappearance often left no trace beyond silence. Yet the mystery persists precisely because of what was once expected to endure. Some of the most significant relics associated with the Crusades are not merely physical objects, but items surrounded by extraordinary narrative weight. Chronicles describe fragments of the True Cross, holy vessels, garments associated with sacred figures, and other objects believed to carry profound spiritual significance. Many of these items appear in early Crusader accounts, only to fade from later inventories. One explanation is redistribution. As Crusader territories shifted, relics were often transferred between churches in Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and later European centers. Over time, as political control fragmented, objects could have been relocated repeatedly, their origins obscured by successive recontextualization. A relic once housed in Jerusalem might later appear in Constantinople, Venice, or France, its history reshaped by the institutions that held it. But this process itself creates uncertainty. Which objects were original, and which were later attributed to earlier origins? Medieval authentication standards differed significantly from modern historical methods. Documentation was often theological rather than archaeological, meaning that provenance was frequently a matter of belief and tradition rather than verifiable chain of custody. This opens a space between history and interpretation. Some scholars suggest that certain relics may never have been singular, fixed objects at all, but rather multiple items believed to share sacred connection through symbolic association. In this view, the loss of relics may sometimes reflect changes in belief systems rather than physical disappearance. Yet there are cases where even symbolic continuity becomes difficult to trace. By the time of the later Crusades and subsequent decline of Crusader control in the Levant, many earlier inventories no longer match surviving records. Objects once described in detail are absent from later lists. Churches that once claimed possession of revered items no longer reference them, or do so only in vague terms. And then there are the accounts that suggest abrupt loss. Sieges, such as those that periodically struck Crusader-held cities, often resulted in rapid evacuation of religious treasures. Some chronicles hint at relics being buried for protection, hidden within church walls, or transported under dangerous conditions across sea routes back to Europe. Whether all of these efforts succeeded is unclear. A few relics do survive in later European traditions, housed in cathedrals and treasuries across the continent. But establishing a direct and uninterrupted link between these objects and their claimed origins in Jerusalem during the First Crusade remains one of the most debated areas in medieval studies. This ambiguity has led to alternative interpretations. Some suggest that the concept of loss may be partially constructed by gaps in documentation rather than actual disappearance. Others propose that relics were deliberately dispersed to reduce political concentration of religious power in any single location. Still others consider the possibility that some objects were destroyed during periods of intense conflict, leaving only textual echoes behind. Yet none of these explanations fully resolves the inconsistencies in the historical record. What remains is a pattern of appearance and absence, objects described with precision in one moment, then gradually dissolving into uncertainty in the next. Walking through modern Jerusalem, one encounters layers of religious continuity that still shape the city's identity. Yet beneath these living traditions lies a quieter question, embedded in medieval chronicles and archaeological gaps. How many sacred objects once central to the spiritual world of the Crusades have truly survived in identifiable form? And how many have been transformed, relocated, or lost so completely that their presence now exists only in the language of memory? Somewhere between war, devotion, and time, the relics of the First Crusade drift into uncertainty, and the question remains suspended in the silence of history. Were these sacred objects truly lost, or have they simply changed shape within the long passage of belief and forgetting? If the missing relics of the First Crusade remind us how sacred objects can vanish into the shifting tides of war and belief, the next mystery takes us far from the stone cities of the Levant, southward into the dry highlands of Africa, where silence is not carved into cathedrals, but into stone walls that rise from the earth like an unfinished memory. The plateau stretches under a vast southern sky. In present-day Zimbabwe, granite outcrops rise above rolling savanna, their surfaces warmed by sunlight and wind. Among them stands one of Africa's most remarkable archaeological sites, Great Zimbabwe. Massive dry stone walls curve and converge without mortar, shaped entirely through precise placement of stone upon stone. Even in ruin, the scale of construction suggests planning, labor, and intention on an extraordinary level. At its height between the 11th and 15th centuries A.D., Great Zimbabwe was a center of political power, trade, and cultural expression in southeastern Africa. Archaeological evidence indicates long-distance trade networks reaching the Indian Ocean coast and beyond, connecting the region to gold, ivory, and imported goods from distant markets. But beneath the visible ruins lies a quieter and more elusive question. Are there hidden chambers still sealed beneath the stone? The most widely accepted archaeological understanding describes Great Zimbabwe as a complex of elite residences, ceremonial spaces, and enclosures built over generations. Structures such as the Great Enclosure and the Hill Complex reflect evolving architectural phases and social organization. Excavations have uncovered pottery, trade goods, and evidence of everyday life, helping researchers reconstruct aspects of its historical function. Yet the architecture itself continues to provoke deeper questions. The dry stone walls are built with remarkable precision, often following curved and interlocking patterns that suggest both structural and symbolic intent. Some corridors narrow in ways that seem to guide movement, while others open into enclosed spaces that may have held ritual or administrative significance. Within this complexity, some researchers have proposed that additional spaces may remain undiscovered or only partially explored beneath layers of collapse and sediment. Could there be sealed chambers beneath the visible ruins? Mainstream archaeology suggests caution. Much of Great Zimbabwe has been excavated extensively, and while subsurface anomalies have been detected in certain areas through geophysical surveys, these are generally interpreted as collapsed structures, storage pits, or natural geological variations, rather than intact hidden rooms. Still, the possibility of unexplored architectural layers cannot be entirely dismissed. The site was occupied and modified over centuries. Buildings were constructed, abandoned, rebuilt, and expanded. In such a long sequence of occupation, it is not unusual for earlier phases of construction to become buried beneath later developments. Some chambers may exist in partial form, obscured by time and structural collapse rather than intentionally hidden. But interpretation becomes more complex when considering the symbolic nature of the site. Great Zimbabwe was not merely a settlement. It was also a center of authority and ritual practice. Archaeological findings, including figurines, specialized artifacts, and controlled spatial layouts, suggest that certain areas may have been restricted or reserved for elite or ceremonial use. In such contexts, the idea of concealed or inaccessible spaces is not unusual. Some scholars have wondered whether certain enclosures were designed to limit visibility or access, creating physical boundaries between different social or spiritual functions. Over time, if entrances were sealed or structures repurposed, those spaces could have effectively become hidden chambers, not necessarily by design, but through historical transformation. Then there are the more speculative interpretations. Early colonial-era writers, unfamiliar with African architectural traditions, often misunderstood Great Zimbabwe, attributing its construction to external civilizations rather than local societies. While modern archaeology has firmly established indigenous origins, those earlier misconceptions contributed to a long history of alternative theories surrounding the site. Within that legacy, some fringe ideas suggest the presence of lost treasure chambers, secret repositories, or undocumented architectural extensions. These theories often draw on gaps in early excavation records or misinterpretations of collapsed structures. However, no verified archaeological evidence supports the existence of undiscovered treasure vaults or hidden underground complexes of extraordinary scale. Still, the sense of mystery persists, not because of what has been proven, but because of what remains incomplete. Archaeology rarely offers total visibility. Even extensively studied sites can retain pockets of uncertainty, especially when structures are deeply layered, eroded, or partially collapsed. In such cases, absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. It may simply reflect the limits of current detection methods. Modern techniques such as ground-penetrating radar, 3D mapping, and remote sensing continue to refine understanding of Great Zimbabwe's internal structure. These tools have revealed subsurface irregularities, but interpretation remains cautious. Each anomaly must be weighed against natural processes, historical construction phases, and later disturbances. And so the site continues to hold its silence. Walking through the stone corridors today, one encounters a landscape shaped by both precision and decay. Walls curve into shadows. Openings lead to spaces that may once have held activity, ritual, or governance. The wind moves through gaps in the stone, carrying sound but offering no answers. It is not difficult to imagine how, centuries ago, movement through these spaces might have been carefully controlled. Who could enter, who could observe, and who remained outside the boundaries of visibility. If any chambers lie hidden beneath the surface, they are not simply architectural curiosities. They represent the possibility of lost context, spaces where artifacts, inscriptions, or structural details could reshape understanding of how this society organized itself, how authority was expressed, and how daily life intersected with ritual and power. But for now, those possibilities remain unconfirmed. Great Zimbabwe stands as both presence and absence, an immense structure that reveals much, yet still withholds parts of its story. The visible stone speaks clearly. The unseen layers do not. And so the question remains, resting beneath the granite and earth like something carefully preserved or quietly forgotten. Within the heart of Great Zimbabwe, are there still spaces that have never been fully seen? Or are we simply looking at a civilization whose complexity has not yet been completely read? If the hidden chambers beneath Great Zimbabwe suggest that history can still be buried within stone, then the next mystery shifts us northward once more, into colder forests, river valleys, and early medieval settlements where knowledge was not carved into monumental walls, but written on fragile materials that time could easily erase. The river moves slowly through mist. In the lands surrounding modern-day Kiev, Ukraine, the Dnieper River winds through forests and plains that once formed the heart of early Eastern European civilization. Fog settles over the water at dawn, softening the outlines of wooden settlements, churches, and fortified towns that emerged during the early medieval period. It was here, in the realm known as Kievan Rus, that a complex political and cultural world began to take shape between the 9th and 13th centuries, A.D. Trade routes connected the Baltic to Byzantium. River systems served as highways of commerce and communication. Emerging knas, princes, ruled over expanding territories, while Christianity gradually transformed religious life, especially following the conversion of Vladimir the Great in the late 10th century A.D. And within this evolving society, written knowledge began to accumulate, but much of it has vanished. The idea of lost archives in early Kievan Rus does not refer to a single library or institution, but rather to a broader absence. Chronicles, administrative records, religious texts, and political documents that once existed but survive only in fragments, later copies, or indirect references. The most widely known surviving text is the primary Chronicle, compiled in later centuries and attributed in tradition to figures such as the monk Nestor. It provides a narrative of early Rus history, blending political events, oral traditions, and religious interpretation. Yet historians have long noted that this chronicle appears to reflect only a portion of what once existed. So what happened to the rest? The most straightforward explanation is material fragility. Early manuscripts in Kievan Rus were typically written on parchment or other perishable materials. Fires, warfare, damp storage conditions, and the simple passage of time could easily destroy entire collections. Unlike stone inscriptions, written archives required constant care. Without centralized preservation systems, many documents would have been lost within a few generations. But this alone does not fully explain the gaps. Archaeological evidence suggests that Kievan Rus was a literate society with administrative structures, diplomatic correspondence, and ecclesiastical documentation. Contacts with Byzantium alone imply the existence of written treaties, translations, and religious texts that would have circulated widely among clerical and political elites. And yet only a fraction of these materials survives. Some scholars suggest that repeated invasions and political fragmentation played a major role. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century AD, in particular, devastated many urban centers across Kievan Rus territories. Libraries, churches, and administrative hubs were destroyed or abandoned. In such conditions, archives could have been lost in a matter of years. Still, even before these events, the documentary record appears uneven. This has led to further questions. Could parts of the archival tradition have been intentionally destroyed or neglected during periods of political transition? In medieval societies, control over written records often meant control over legitimacy. Chronicles could reinforce dynastic authority or challenge it. In times of upheaval, selective preservation, or elimination of texts was not uncommon. Some historians also point to the possibility of dispersal rather than destruction. As clerics, scribes, and nobles moved between regions, manuscripts may have been carried to other cultural centers, Novgorod, Byzantium, or later emerging principalities. Over time, these texts could have been absorbed into new traditions, copied, modified, or lost within larger collections where their original context was no longer recognized. In this sense, loss may sometimes mean transformation rather than disappearance. Yet even with these explanations, the sense of absence remains striking. There are references in later writings to texts that no longer survive. Some medieval authors cite earlier works whose originals are unknown today. Others allude to records of treaties, genealogies, and religious writings that cannot be fully reconstructed. These traces suggest a wider written culture than what currently exists in surviving archives. And then there are the more speculative interpretations. Some researchers have wondered whether undiscovered manuscript caches may still exist beneath monastic ruins or buried within early settlement layers along riverbanks. In regions where wooden architecture and manuscript storage were closely linked, entire archives could theoretically remain concealed under collapsed structures or later rebuilding phases. Other, more imaginative theories propose that important documents were deliberately hidden during times of invasion or political instability, possibly in underground storage spaces, sealed chambers, or remote monastic sites. However, no confirmed discovery has yet validated these ideas. Modern archaeology and manuscript studies continue to refine understanding of early East Slavic literacy and record-keeping. Fragmentary birchbark writings discovered in Novgorod, for example, reveal everyday communication, letters, notes, and economic records, suggesting that written culture was more widespread than once assumed. But these fragments also highlight how much has not survived. The contrast is striking. A society clearly engaged in writing, administration, and religious scholarship, yet with only a partial documentary footprint preserved through centuries of upheaval. Standing along the Dnieper today, it is possible to imagine scrolls and codices once moving along these waterways, texts carried between courts, monasteries, and trading centers. Some would have been preserved, others copied, and many ultimately lost. The river itself continues its course, indifferent to what it once carried. So the question remains open, suspended between archaeology, history, and silence. How much of early Kievan Rus was written down and then lost, not in a single event, but through centuries of change, disruption, and forgetting? And how many of those missing pages might still be waiting, hidden beneath layers of earth or within archives not yet fully understood? If the lost archives of early Kievan Rus remind us how entire intellectual worlds can fade into fragments, the next mystery shifts once more across the map of medieval history toward a sudden and almost disorienting transformation in power, where an empire appears not gradually constructed, but seemingly to emerge fully formed from the shifting landscapes of Central Asia and the Middle East. The horizon is wide and dust-laden. Across the steppes of Central Asia, grasslands stretch endlessly beneath an open sky. Herds move slowly across the plains, guided by seasonal rhythms older than recorded history. Wind carries fine earth across the landscape, softening the boundaries between distance and memory. It is here, among nomadic confederations and tribal networks, that the roots of one of the most influential medieval powers begin to take shape. This is the world from which the Seljuk Empire would rise. Yet its emergence, as recorded in historical sources, feels unusually rapid. By the 11th century AD, Seljuk forces had moved from relatively modest origins to dominate vast territories stretching across Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Within a relatively short span of time, they had transformed from a confederation of Turkic tribes into a structured imperial power capable of challenging established dynasties and reshaping the political landscape of the Islamic world. How did this happen so quickly? The most widely accepted explanation begins with migration and military organization. The Seljuks were part of the broader Oghuz Turkic world, a network of tribes that moved across Central Asia in response to environmental pressures, political conflicts, and shifting alliances. Under the leadership of figures such as Tughril Beg, they began to consolidate power through a combination of military skill, strategic alliances, and integration into existing political structures. Rather than replacing existing systems outright, they often absorbed them. In Persia, for example, Seljuk rulers adopted aspects of Persian administrative practice, drawing on established bureaucratic traditions to govern newly acquired territories. This blending of nomadic military strength and sedentary administrative expertise is often cited as a key factor in their rapid expansion. But even this explanation raises deeper questions, because the speed of transformation still feels extraordinary. Within a few decades, the Seljuks were not only controlling territory, they were shaping religious institutions, influencing cultural production, and engaging directly with the political heart of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Their rise altered the balance of power across the region in ways that contemporaries struggled to fully comprehend. Some historical accounts describe their arrival almost as a force of inevitability, as if their expansion followed a momentum that had been building unseen. But what fueled that momentum? One mainstream interpretation emphasizes the fragmentation of surrounding powers. By the 11th century AD, the Islamic world was politically divided. Regional dynasties competed for authority, while the Abbasid Caliphate, though spiritually significant, had limited direct military control. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, faced its own internal and external pressures. In such a landscape, emerging powers like the Seljuks encountered opportunities for expansion into contested or lightly defended regions. Still, opportunity alone does not fully explain coherence, because expansion requires coordination, and coordination implies structure. This leads to another layer of interpretation: the role of military organization and cultural adaptation. The Seljuks appear to have developed highly mobile cavalry forces, capable of rapid movement across difficult terrain. Their familiarity with steppe warfare provided a tactical advantage that was difficult for more stationary armies to counter. Yet even this advantage does not entirely resolve the question of scale. How did relatively dispersed tribal groups integrate into a functioning imperial system so effectively? Some scholars point to the role of shared identity and leadership consolidation. Under strong central figures, tribal loyalties may have been redirected toward broader political structures. Religious legitimacy also played a role, as the Seljuks positioned themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy within the Islamic world, aligning themselves with the Abbasid Caliphate in a way that granted both symbolic and political authority. But there are still gaps in the narrative. Early sources are uneven, often written from perspectives outside Seljuk society itself. Byzantine chroniclers, for example, describe their expansion with a sense of shock and urgency, sometimes portraying their arrival as sudden or overwhelming. Islamic sources, while more detailed, still leave certain transitions only partially documented. This unevenness has allowed space for alternative interpretations. Some historians suggest that the Seljuk rise may have been less abrupt than it appears, arguing that earlier stages of migration and integration were simply underdocumented. In this view, what looks like sudden emergence is actually the visible peak of a longer, less recorded process of gradual accumulation. Others consider the possibility that environmental pressures played a stronger role than traditionally emphasized. Shifts in climate across Central Asia could have influenced migration patterns, pushing groups westward and increasing competition for resources, thereby accelerating political consolidation. Then there are more speculative ideas, though not widely supported. A few interpretations propose that the Seljuk expansion benefited from unusually rapid cultural synchronization across Turkic groups, allowing for faster unification than typical tribal systems might permit. Others suggest that the administrative frameworks they adopted were so effective that they enabled exponential growth once initial thresholds were reached. Yet none of these theories fully captures the sense of acceleration recorded in historical accounts. What remains consistent across sources is the perception of movement. Armies advancing, cities changing hands, borders shifting with a speed that challenged contemporary understanding of political stability. By the time Seljuk authority extended deep into Anatolia, culminating in encounters that would eventually reshape relations with Byzantine territories, the empire had already transformed the geopolitical structure of the region. And yet, the origins of that transformation remain partially obscured, not in the sense of a missing event, but in the sense of incomplete clarity. How multiple processes converged in a relatively short historical window to produce a power capable of altering the balance of entire regions. Standing in the modern landscapes once traversed by Seljuk expansion, steppe, plateau, and mountain corridor, it is possible to trace the roots of movement, but not always the precise mechanisms of change. Archaeology reveals fortifications, settlements, and trade networks, but the internal dynamics of early consolidation remain partially hidden behind the limits of surviving evidence. So the question remains open, resting between history and interpretation. Did the Seljuk Empire rise through a gradual process that only appears sudden in hindsight, or was there a moment, still not fully understood, when fragmented forces aligned in a way that transformed movement into empire almost overnight? If the sudden rise of the Seljuk Empire reveals how power can appear almost accelerated by history itself, the next mystery shifts us into a very different kind of imperial space, one defined not by expansion across open landscapes, but by the concentrated symbolism of courts, where power is worn, displayed, and ultimately, sometimes lost. The light inside the imperial halls is dim and reflective. Within the heart of Constantinople, stone corridors once echoed with ceremonial movement, the measured pace of officials, and the quiet tension of court politics. The city, seat of the Byzantine Empire, was not only a political capital, but a living archive of imperial identity. Gold mosaics shimmered under vaulted ceilings, and processional routes guided emperors through spaces designed to project continuity, legitimacy, and divine favor. It was here, within the world of the Byzantine Empire, that the imperial regalia represented more than authority. They were embodiments of power itself. Crown, scepter, ceremonial robes, sacred vessels, and jeweled insignia. Each object was part of a carefully constructed language of rule. These items were not merely decorative. They were integral to coronations, court rituals, diplomatic receptions, and religious ceremonies that reinforced the emperor's position as God's representative on earth. Yet parts of this system of symbols were lost, not in a single moment of destruction, but through a long sequence of court intrigues, political upheavals, and fragmentary historical transitions that make their full recovery impossible today. The most widely documented turning point comes during periods of internal instability, particularly in the 11th and 12th centuries AD, when court factions, military revolts, and succession crises repeatedly reshaped the imperial structure. Among the rulers navigating this complex environment was Alexios I Komnenos, whose reign marked a period of recovery after severe territorial losses. Yet even during stabilizing reigns, the imperial treasury and regalia were vulnerable, not only to external threats, but to internal redistribution. Because in Byzantium, power was often negotiated through access to symbols, and symbols could be moved. The regalia of the empire were stored in sacred treasuries, palaces, and churches connected to the imperial household. Some items were used only during major ceremonies, while others were kept under strict guard. But these objects were also subject to political pressure: confiscation during coups, redistribution during regime changes, and relocation during emergencies. Over time, this created gaps. Inventories from different centuries do not always align. Objects described in earlier accounts are missing from later lists. Some items appear briefly in diplomatic descriptions, gift exchanges with foreign courts, coronation ceremonies, or religious processions, only to disappear from subsequent records. What happened to them? The most straightforward explanation is fragmentation through political instability. The Byzantine court was not static. Emperors were deposed, restored, exiled, or replaced in rapid succession during certain periods. Each transition created opportunities for the redistribution of imperial property. Regalia could be seized by rival factions, hidden for protection, or melted down to fund military campaigns. In moments of crisis, symbolism often became currency. Gold and jewels could be repurposed. Ceremonial objects could be broken apart or reconfigured. What once functioned as a unified system of imperial identity could be dismantled into components of survival. Yet even this pragmatic explanation leaves unanswered questions, because certain regalia were not easily replaceable. Some items carried not only material value, but profound ceremonial continuity. The imperial crown, for example, was not merely a piece of goldsmithing. It was tied to coronation rituals that reinforced legitimacy across generations. Losing such objects would have required either careful replacement or significant adaptation of ritual practice. And yet Byzantine ceremonial tradition persisted with remarkable continuity, which suggests that either replacements were created with careful replication, or original objects survived in altered or relocated forms. Some historians propose that certain regalia may have been transferred to religious institutions, absorbed into the treasury of major churches such as the Hagia Sophia, or moved during periods of crisis to secure locations outside Constantinople. In such cases, the objects would not have been lost in the traditional sense, but redistributed into different institutional contexts where their original identity became less visible. But documentation remains incomplete. Another layer of complexity emerges during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 AD, when Constantinople was captured and extensively looted by Western European forces. This event is often cited as one of the most significant disruptions in Byzantine material culture. Imperial treasures were seized, transported, and dispersed across Europe. Some items entered royal collections in Venice, France, and other Western courts. Others were melted down, repurposed, or lost during transport. Chronicles from both Byzantine and Latin sources describe immense quantities of gold, relics, and ceremonial objects changing hands during this period. Yet even here, the record is inconsistent. Certain regalia appear in later European inventories with vague or disputed origins. Others vanish entirely after being mentioned in accounts of the sack, leaving no clear trace of their subsequent fate. This has led to centuries of speculation. Could some pieces of imperial regalia still exist in European treasuries, their Byzantine origins obscured by later reinterpretation? Some artifacts in medieval collections have uncertain provenance, and while many have been studied extensively, not all can be definitively traced back to Constantinople. Other theories suggest deliberate concealment. In periods of extreme political threat, valuable objects were sometimes hidden within religious foundations, sealed within palace walls, or transported under secret arrangements to safer regions. If such measures were taken for imperial regalia, they may have succeeded in preserving objects physically while erasing their documentary trail. There are also interpretive uncertainties. Byzantine ceremonial culture was highly adaptive. Rituals evolved over time, and symbolic objects could be replaced or modified without necessarily breaking continuity. This raises a difficult question for historians. When an object is replaced with a functionally identical successor, does the original truly disappear, or does it persist through ritual continuity? In this sense, loss becomes difficult to define. Archaeological evidence offers limited clarity. While many Byzantine treasures have been recovered in fragments, hoards, or museum collections, no complete set of imperial regalia has survived intact from any single historical period of the empire's long existence. What remains is a mosaic of partial survivals and documented absences. Standing within the surviving architecture of Constantinople today, where Byzantine walls still rise alongside later Ottoman structures, it is possible to sense the layering of imperial identity across time. Yet the physical objects that once defined the visible presence of imperial authority are largely gone or dispersed. So the question remains suspended in the quiet of historical uncertainty. Did the Byzantine imperial regalia truly disappear through the violence and intrigue of court politics and conquest, or do fragments of these symbols still exist, hidden within collections, institutions, and traditions that no longer recognize their original imperial source? If the fate of the Byzantine imperial regalia shows how symbols of power can fracture across courts and centuries, the next mystery moves away from palaces and into motion itself, into the hidden arteries of medieval commerce, where goods, ideas, and dangers traveled along routes that were never fully controlled, never fully recorded, and often deliberately concealed. The desert is never still. Under a vast sky, dunes shift slowly with the wind, reshaping paths that existed only briefly before being erased again. In other regions, high mountain passes cut through stone like forgotten corridors, while river valleys carve narrow lifelines through otherwise impassable terrain. Across this immense geography stretched the Silk Road, not a single road, but a web of overlapping routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. It was along these routes that merchants, pilgrims, envoys, and travelers moved between civilizations. And alongside them, less visible figures moved in the margins. Smugglers. The idea of illicit trade in the medieval Silk Road world is not a modern projection. Historical records from multiple regions, Chinese administrative texts, Persian commercial accounts, and Islamic legal writings, describe efforts to regulate, tax, and sometimes suppress unauthorized movement of goods. Wherever official systems of control existed, parallel systems of evasion tended to emerge. But the exact pathways of these clandestine networks remain elusive. Unlike major caravan routes that passed through well-known cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, smuggling routes were often intentionally indirect. They were shaped by geography, political fragmentation, and local knowledge passed between traders who rarely recorded their methods in writing. So how did these hidden routes function? The most widely accepted understanding begins with geography and necessity. The Silk Road passed through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Deserts like the Taklamakan, mountain systems such as the Pamirs and Hindu Kush, and vast steppe regions where political authority could shift rapidly. In such environments, official caravan routes were vulnerable to taxation, banditry, and military conflict. Smugglers exploited these pressures. Instead of following established cities and fortified checkpoints, they moved along secondary paths, riverbeds that appeared only seasonally, mountain passes known only to local guides, and desert corridors that shifted with wind and weather. These routes were often invisible to outsiders, but deeply familiar to those who lived within the landscape. Knowledge was the key currency. A guide who understood where water could be found beneath desert sand, or which mountain path remained passable during a narrow seasonal window, held information more valuable than gold. This knowledge was rarely written down. It was transmitted orally, through apprenticeship, trust networks, and family ties. Yet even this explanation raises deeper questions. Because smuggling on the Silk Road was not limited to avoiding taxes or tariffs. Certain goods were restricted, controlled, or politically sensitive. Silk itself, spices, precious metals, rare textiles, and even manuscripts could become part of informal trade systems that bypassed official oversight. In some cases, entire categories of luxury goods moved through unofficial channels before re-entering legitimate markets in distant cities. This creates a paradox. Goods that appear in historical records as part of regulated trade may have passed through unregulated pathways for part of their journey. A bolt of silk documented in a Chinese imperial account might later appear in a Persian bazaar, its intermediate movement largely invisible to surviving records. So, where are the gaps? One of the most intriguing aspects of Silk Road smuggling is the absence of direct documentation. Unlike official caravans, which often left records for taxation or diplomatic purposes, smugglers had no incentive to preserve written traces of their routes. As a result, historians must reconstruct their existence indirectly, through legal disputes, confiscation records, and scattered references in administrative archives. Even these hints are fragmented. Some texts mention goods seized in unexpected locations. Others refer to traders accused of bypassing official checkpoints, often without detailing how they accomplished it. Occasionally, archaeological finds reveal unexpected combinations of materials or objects in regions where they should not have easily arrived through regulated trade alone. These anomalies suggest movement outside official networks, but the shape of that movement remains unclear. Some scholars propose that smuggling routes often mirrored legitimate Silk Road paths, diverging only at critical points, mountain passes, river crossings, or border regions, before rejoining main corridors later. In this view, smuggling was not a separate system, but a parallel layer embedded within the same geography. Others suggest a more decentralized model. According to this interpretation, smuggling networks may have functioned through loosely connected nodes rather than continuous routes. Individual traders, local intermediaries, and nomadic groups could have operated independently, linking together opportunistically rather than through fixed pathways. This would make the system highly adaptable, but extremely difficult to reconstruct. Then there is the role of political fragmentation. The Silk Road crossed numerous competing empires, kingdoms, and tribal regions. Borders were not always clearly defined, and authority could vary dramatically over short distances. In such conditions, what counted as legal trade in one region might be considered illicit in another. Smuggling, therefore, was not always a fixed category. It was often situational. A merchant avoiding one tax regime might be considered legitimate in another. A caravan bypassing a hostile region might be acting out of necessity rather than criminal intent. This ambiguity complicates modern attempts to distinguish between official and unofficial trade networks. And yet, despite this ambiguity, patterns emerge. Certain regions appear repeatedly in historical references associated with irregular trade activity. Mountain corridors in Central Asia, desert edge settlements along the Iranian plateau, and remote oasis towns often functioned as transitional spaces where goods could be exchanged outside formal oversight. But even here, the details remain partial. What exactly moved through these routes beyond official records? Were there entire categories of goods that rarely entered formal documentation? And how much of Silk Road commerce operated in parallel systems that simply never left a written trace? Some speculative interpretations suggest that smuggling networks may have played a larger role in cultural diffusion than previously assumed. Ideas, technologies, and artistic motifs could have traveled alongside goods in informal exchanges that bypassed official channels. However, while cultural transmission is well documented along the Silk Road, attributing it specifically to smuggling networks remains difficult to prove. Archaeology adds another layer of uncertainty. Finds in remote desert sites, abandoned caravanserais, buried settlements, and isolated trading posts sometimes reveal objects that suggest unexpected connections between distant regions. Yet interpreting these connections requires caution, as trade networks were already extensive and complex, even without invoking hidden systems. Still, the question persists. How much of the Silk Road's true complexity is visible in surviving records, and how much operated in the shadows of unofficial movement? Standing in the vast silence of the Taklamakan Desert today, where shifting sands conceal and reveal ancient pathways without warning, it is not difficult to imagine caravans moving not only along known routes, but also along less visible corridors. Paths guided by memory, necessity, and knowledge shared quietly between individuals rather than institutions. Some of those routes may still lie beneath the surface, their patterns erased by time, but not entirely lost. So the question remains open, suspended between geography and history. Were the Silk Road smuggling routes merely deviations from known paths, or did they form an entire hidden network of movement that shaped medieval trade in ways we are only beginning to understand? If the hidden routes of Silk Road smugglers remind us that history often moves through unseen corridors, then the next mystery shifts away from trade altogether, into something far more enduring, carved not across landscapes, but directly into living stone itself. The air is thin and still at this altitude. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, the ground rises into rugged plateaus cut by deep valleys and winding escarpments. Morning mist drifts through the rock, softening the edges of cliffs that seem to have been shaped more by intention than by nature. From a distance, the landscape appears almost untouched, but as one draws closer, the stone begins to reveal its secrets, not built upon the earth, but carved from it. These are the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. Entire sanctuaries were excavated downward from solid volcanic rock. Their facades, corridors, pillars, and interior chambers all formed by removal rather than construction. Some structures are connected by narrow trenches, others by tunnels that disappear beneath the surface. Roof lines sit level with the surrounding ground, as if the buildings have been lowered into the earth rather than raised above it. And yet, despite extensive study, one question remains surprisingly difficult to answer with certainty. Who, exactly, built them? The most widely accepted historical account attributes these churches to the reign of King Lalibela during the late 12th and early 13th centuries A.D. According to tradition, Lalibela envisioned the creation of a new Jerusalem after pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land became difficult for Ethiopian Christians to access. In this interpretation, the churches were not only architectural achievements, but also spiritual reconstructions of sacred geography, designed to replicate holy sites symbolically within Africa. Many of the churches still bear names referencing biblical locations, a symbolic River Jordan, a Golgotha-like elevation, and interconnected sanctuaries that mirror a spiritual map rather than a purely geographical one. But while the religious and cultural framework is well established, the technical origins of the construction remain partially uncertain, because what is visible today represents an engineering achievement of extraordinary precision. Each church was carved top-down into hard volcanic tuff. This is not a soft material. It requires controlled removal using tools capable of sustained precision over long periods. The scale of excavation suggests coordinated labor, advanced planning, and a deep understanding of structural stability. Yet the historical record provides limited detail about the workforce behind it. Traditional accounts often describe divine inspiration guiding the construction, sometimes accompanied by angelic assistance or miraculous intervention in religious narratives. While these accounts hold profound spiritual meaning, they do not fully address the practical question of how such precise excavation was achieved using the tools available at the time. So what does archaeology suggest? Most scholars agree that the churches were created through a combination of skilled craftsmanship, organized labor, and extended periods of construction, likely spanning decades. Evidence of tool marks, unfinished sections, and incremental modifications supports the idea of a long-term building process rather than instantaneous creation. However, some aspects remain difficult to fully reconstruct. For example, the uniformity and precision of certain architectural features across multiple churches suggest coordinated planning that may have required advanced surveying or shared architectural knowledge. The alignment of passages, the consistency of structural proportions, and the integration of drainage systems all indicate a sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. But there are no surviving detailed construction manuals from the period, no architectural blueprints, no written technical explanations describing step-by-step excavation methods. This absence creates space for interpretation. One mainstream hypothesis suggests that skilled artisans from regional stoneworking traditions were employed under royal patronage, gradually developing and transmitting techniques across generations. Ethiopia, with its long history of stone architecture and ecclesiastical development, would have had access to both labor and expertise. Yet even this explanation leaves certain questions open. Why does the scale of the Lalibela complex appear so concentrated in a relatively short historical window? And why do some architectural elements seem to reflect influences that are difficult to trace directly within earlier local structures? These uncertainties have led some researchers to consider broader regional interactions. Ethiopia, situated between Africa, the Red Sea, and the wider Indian Ocean world, was not isolated. Trade routes connected it to Egypt, Arabia, and beyond. Ideas, artisans, and religious influences moved across these networks. It is possible that architectural knowledge arrived through multiple channels, blending local traditions with external techniques. But identifying specific contributors remains challenging. The Rock-Hewn churches do not carry inscriptions naming individual architects or builders in the way later European cathedrals sometimes do. Instead, they exist as collective works, attributed broadly to a royal vision rather than a documented team of engineers. This anonymity itself becomes part of the mystery. Some alternative interpretations suggest that the construction may have involved multiple phases of development, with earlier religious or ritual sites later expanded or reconfigured into the complex seen today. In this view, Lalibela may represent not a single construction event, but a layering of sacred spaces over time. Archaeological evidence does show signs of modification in certain structures, indicating that some churches were altered, repaired, or expanded after their initial creation. Still, the foundational phase remains difficult to fully trace. There are also speculative ideas, though not supported by mainstream archaeology, which propose that knowledge of rock-cut architecture may have been more widespread across regions of the medieval world than surviving evidence suggests. In this interpretation, Lalibela would represent a peak of a broader but poorly documented tradition of subterranean or monolithic construction. However, no direct evidence confirms a global architectural network of this kind. What does remain clear is the extraordinary technical achievement represented by the site itself. Inside the churches, light enters through carefully positioned openings, illuminating carved columns, arches, and ceilings shaped entirely from living rock. The acoustic properties of some chambers suggest intentional design for liturgical sound, while drainage channels carved into the floors reveal attention to environmental control. Every surface bears the marks of removal, stone taken away rather than placed. Standing within these spaces today, one experiences a sense of both presence and absence. The builders are everywhere in the result, but nowhere in the record. Their tools are gone. Their names are largely unknown. Their methods are partially understood, yet not fully reconstructed. And so the question deepens. Were these churches the product of a single visionary moment under royal direction, or the culmination of generations of evolving stoneworking traditions whose origins extend further back than surviving records can show? Somewhere beneath the carved corridors and hidden passages, the answers may still be embedded in the stone itself, waiting for interpretation, or perhaps for discoveries yet to be made. Until then, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela remain what they have always been, a silence carved into architecture, inviting us to ask not only how they were built, but who first imagined that entire sanctuaries could be drawn out of solid earth, and why that knowledge leaves so few traces behind. If the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela show how devotion can be carved directly into stone, then the next mystery moves from sacred architecture to something far more fragile in the historical record: wealth itself, and how even the greatest fortunes of medieval kings can dissolve into uncertainty. The sea is restless here. Along the cold northern edges of Europe, waves strike rocky coastlines where land and ocean blur into one another. Wind moves across the North Sea with a steady, grinding persistence, carrying salt and mist into the low skies above England, Denmark, and the Scandinavian shores. In this world of shifting tides and political expansion, power was measured not only in land, but in ships, tribute, and gold. It was here that the reign of Canute the Great unfolded. His empire, often described as a North Sea empire, connected England, Denmark, and Norway under a single ruler in the early 11th century AD. It was one of the most remarkable political unifications of early medieval Europe, built through conquest, diplomacy, and control of maritime routes. But behind the image of consolidated power lies a quieter and more elusive question. What happened to his riches? King Canute ruled over territories that generated substantial wealth: tributes from England, trade revenues from Scandinavia, and resources drawn from a network of coastal settlements and inland estates. His court would have accumulated significant stores of silver, gold, and high-value goods, much of it tied to military administration and royal authority. Yet when historians attempt to trace the full extent of his treasury, they encounter gaps. Not everything can be accounted for. The most straightforward explanation is historical fragmentation. Canute's empire did not endure as a unified structure after his death in 1035 AD. Within a relatively short period, his territories were divided among successors. Political instability followed, and the cohesive administrative system that had supported imperial control began to fracture. In such transitions, royal wealth is often redistributed. Treasuries are divided among heirs. Resources are used to secure loyalty. Military payments drain accumulated reserves. Some assets are transferred between courts, while others are lost in conflict or absorbed into local power structures. This process alone could account for a significant portion of missing royal wealth. But the story is not entirely straightforward. Contemporary records from England and Scandinavia suggest that Canute's administration was unusually organized for its time. His rule integrated English and Scandinavian systems of taxation and governance, allowing for more consistent revenue collection than many of his predecessors. This raises an important question. If the system was so effective, why does the historical footprint of his accumulated wealth appear incomplete? Part of the difficulty lies in the nature of medieval record-keeping. Financial documentation was not standardized, and inventories were often partial, context-specific, or lost during later upheavals. What survives today represents only fragments of a broader administrative reality. Yet fragments can still suggest scale. Archaeological finds across England and Denmark from the early 11th century AD include hoards of silver, coinage, and imported goods that reflect the circulation of wealth during Canute's era. Some of these hoards are vast, indicating the presence of substantial economic activity. But linking these directly to the royal treasury is not always possible. So where did the centralized riches go? One interpretation suggests deliberate redistribution. Canute's reign required balancing multiple kingdoms, each with its own elites and power structures. Wealth may have been strategically allocated to maintain stability, funding local authorities, rewarding loyalty, and securing political alliances. In this view, the lost riches are not missing, but dispersed. Another possibility is maritime loss. Canute's power was deeply connected to naval strength. Ships transported tribute, soldiers, and goods across the North Sea. Maritime travel in the 11th century was dangerous, and shipwrecks were not uncommon. Some historians have suggested that portions of royal wealth may have been lost at sea, carried down with vessels that never reached their destination. The North Sea itself is a difficult archive. Cold, shifting, and sediment-rich, it preserves some materials while erasing others. If royal cargoes were lost in transit, they may now lie beneath layers of sand and silt, indistinguishable from countless other shipwrecks across centuries of trade and warfare. But even this explanation does not fully resolve the uncertainty. There are references in later medieval traditions to immense wealth associated with Canute's reign, stories of vast treasures, legendary payments, and extraordinary riches that seem to grow in scale over time. These accounts, while not always reliable as literal records, reflect a cultural memory of abundance that exceeds what can be fully documented today. This raises a different kind of question. Not only what happened to the wealth, but how it was remembered. In some cases, royal riches become part of mythic tradition, expanding in narrative form even as historical records remain incomplete. Wealth becomes symbolic, representing power, legitimacy, and control over a vast and interconnected realm. Yet symbolism does not replace material history. Coins can be traced, hoards can be excavated, trade patterns can be reconstructed. But the centralized treasury of a ruler whose empire spanned multiple kingdoms remains difficult to reconstruct in full detail. There are also regional variations to consider. In England, Canute's reign is associated with relative stability and integration into existing administrative systems. In Denmark and Norway, however, the political landscape was more fluid, with shifting alliances and local power centers. Wealth moving through these regions may have followed different trajectories, complicating any attempt to trace a unified royal treasury. Some historians suggest that what is often described as lost riches may actually represent the absence of a centralized accounting system rather than the disappearance of physical wealth. In other words, the riches existed, but were never fully consolidated in a way that modern historians can reconstruct. Still, certain anomalies remain. Coin hoards appear in unexpected places. Foreign silver circulates in quantities that suggest large-scale redistribution. And written references to payments, tributes, and royal expenditures sometimes exceed what surviving records can account for. These inconsistencies leave space for interpretation. Could parts of Canute's wealth have been intentionally hidden during periods of political instability? Could caches have been buried for protection and never recovered? Some treasure traditions in Northern Europe hint at hidden royal deposits, but archaeological confirmation remains elusive. Other interpretations remain more cautious, emphasizing the limits of surviving evidence rather than the presence of undiscovered hoards. What is certain is that wealth in the medieval world was rarely static. It moved constantly through taxation, gift-giving, warfare, trade, and redistribution. What appears lost in one record may reappear in another context, transformed in form or function. Standing along the windswept coasts once connected to Canute's realm today, it is possible to imagine ships crossing between kingdoms, carrying not only goods, but the economic foundations of empire itself. Some of those journeys are recorded, many are not. And so the question remains open, suspended between archaeology and history. Are the riches of King Canute truly lost, or have they simply been dispersed across time, buried not in a single hidden vault, but scattered across landscapes, oceans, and records that no longer tell a unified story? If the scattered echoes of King Canute's wealth remind us how even empires dissolve into uncertainty, the next mystery turns away from gold and kingdoms entirely and into something quieter, but perhaps even more elusive: the voice of history itself, and the question of who chose what would be remembered. The parchment is fragile, almost translucent with age. In monastery scriptoria across early medieval England, candlelight would have flickered over wooden desks as scribes bent over manuscripts, copying lines of Latin and Old English with careful precision. Ink would have seeped into parchment fibers, preserving not only events, but interpretation, how those events were understood, framed, and remembered. Among these works, one of the most significant is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It is not a single document, but a collection of related manuscripts, compiled and copied across centuries in different monastic centers. Beginning in the late 9th century AD during the reign of Alfred the Great, the Chronicle records events in England's political and social life, continuing through successive generations. But as the entries progress into later centuries, a subtle mystery emerges. The identity of its continuators becomes increasingly uncertain. We know that multiple versions of the Chronicle exist, often referred to by scholars as different manuscript branches. Some were maintained in Winchester, others in Abingdon, Worcester, and possibly Canterbury. Each version contains variations, omissions, and unique additions, suggesting that different scribes or communities were responsible for their continuation. Yet the specific individuals behind these continuations remain largely unnamed. Who were they? The most widely accepted explanation is that they were monastic scribes, educated members of religious communities tasked with recording both local and national events. In this view, the Chronicle was not authored by a single figure, but sustained collectively over generations. Each scribe added entries relevant to their time, often drawing on local knowledge, oral reports, and earlier texts. This would make the Chronicle less a unified narrative and more a living document, constantly rewritten by those entrusted with preserving memory. But even this explanation leaves open questions. Because the Chronicle is not purely administrative, it is also interpretive. Certain entries reflect clear political perspectives, favoring particular rulers or framing events in ways that suggest editorial judgment rather than neutral record-keeping. This raises the possibility that the continuators were not merely passive scribes, but active participants in shaping historical narrative. So were they historians in the modern sense, or something closer to chroniclers of institutional memory? The distinction is not simple. Monastic scribes were often deeply embedded in the political and religious structures of their time. Their work was shaped by patronage, ecclesiastical authority, and the priorities of the communities they served. As a result, the Chronicle reflects not only what was known, but what was deemed important enough to preserve. This introduces a layer of anonymity that is both practical and conceptual. Many entries are written in the first-person plural or impersonal phrasing, offering no clear signature of authorship. Even when specific events are described in detail, the identity of the writer remains invisible behind the text. Over time, this anonymity becomes part of the Chronicle's structure. Some scholars have attempted to identify stylistic patterns within different manuscript versions, suggesting that certain continuations may have been written by distinct individuals or scribal schools. Linguistic analysis has revealed subtle variations in vocabulary, tone, and orthography that hint at multiple hands shaping the text across regions and decades. Yet these findings stop short of definitive identification. No names survive attached to the later continuations in a way that allows firm attribution. This absence has led to broader questions about medieval authorship itself. In the early medieval world, the concept of individual authorship was often secondary to institutional identity. A text produced within a monastery might be understood as belonging to the community rather than to a single writer. The authority of the text derived from its place of origin, not necessarily from personal attribution. In this sense, the author of the Chronicle may have been the monastery itself. But even within this framework, variation exists. Different monastic centers appear to have maintained their own versions of the Chronicle, sometimes with regional bias or emphasis. Events in one area may be described in detail in one manuscript while appearing briefly or not at all in another. This raises a further question. Were the continuations coordinated or independent? The evidence suggests a mixture of both. Some entries appear to draw from shared sources, indicating communication between religious centers. Others reflect localized perspectives, suggesting independent compilation. Over time, as manuscripts were copied and recopied, layers of revision accumulated, blurring the boundaries between original composition and later addition. And then there is the question of silence. Certain historical events are recorded in the Chronicle with striking brevity, while others are omitted entirely. These gaps may reflect lost sources, editorial decisions, or simply the limits of what scribes had access to. But in historical analysis, absence is never neutral. What is left unwritten can be as significant as what is preserved. Some modern researchers have proposed that the later continuations of the Chronicle may have been influenced by shifting political pressures, particularly during periods of instability such as the Norman conquest of 1066 AD. In such contexts, the act of recording history could itself become sensitive, shaped by new regimes or changing institutional priorities. This introduces the possibility that certain continuations were not only written, but carefully curated. Still, no direct evidence identifies a single controlling author or centralized editorial authority behind the later manuscripts. Instead, what emerges is a distributed network of voices, monks, scribes, and communities, each contributing fragments to a long and evolving record. And yet, even within this collective model, the sense of mystery persists. Because when we read the Chronicle today, we encounter not only events, but a curated flow of memory. We see battles, coronations, invasions, and political shifts, but the individuals shaping this record remain largely invisible. Their handwriting survives, their identities do not. Walking through the remains of monastic sites in England today, one can still imagine the quiet rhythm of scribal work, the scraping of quills, the turning of pages, the slow accumulation of years into text. These were not anonymous in their own time, but they have become so in ours. And so the question remains suspended in the fragile space between history and text. Who truly wrote the continuations of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the named and unknown scribes of monasteries, a coordinated tradition of institutional memory, or a chain of individual voices now indistinguishable from the record they helped create? If the identity of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's continuators dissolves into a web of monastic hands and institutional memory, then the mystery deepens when we consider what those same scribes chose not to record. Those deliberate silences that sit between surviving entries like gaps in a carefully torn manuscript. The ink has faded in places where history grows quieter. Across the monastic landscapes of early medieval England, the act of writing history was never separate from the pressures of the present. Wars, successions, famines, and ecclesiastical reforms all shaped what could be written, and just as importantly, what might be softened, delayed, or omitted entirely. Within the surviving manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, certain years expand into detailed narrative, while others contract into brief, almost reluctant lines. And then there are the blank spaces, years where events must have occurred, yet are recorded with striking minimalism, or not at all. Why? Mainstream historical interpretation often returns to practical explanations. Scribes could only record what they knew. News traveled slowly. Monastic centers were not always informed of distant events in real time. In some cases, political instability may have interrupted the very act of record-keeping itself. These are reasonable constraints, but they do not fully explain the uneven texture of the chronicle. Because even when information was available, selection still occurred. A battle might be described in detail in one manuscript tradition and barely acknowledged in another. A king's reign could be framed as divinely sanctioned in one version and cautiously ambiguous in another. These differences suggest not only transmission gaps, but editorial decisions, choices about emphasis, framing, and tone. And those choices point back to the invisible authors, or perhaps, more accurately, to the invisible communities behind them. Monasteries were not isolated writing chambers. They were deeply embedded in political networks. Kings and nobles often supported religious houses, and in return, monasteries reinforced legitimacy through prayer, literacy, and historical narrative. Writing history in this context was also an act of alignment. So when we ask who continued the chronicle, we are also asking, who benefited from how it was continued? Some scholars propose that certain continuations may have been shaped by shifting political landscapes, especially during moments of regime change. After the Norman conquest of 1066 AD, for example, England underwent profound administrative and cultural transformation. Old English scribal traditions gradually gave way to new linguistic and institutional frameworks. And yet the chronicle continued. In some monasteries, entries persist into the 12th century, preserving a voice that feels increasingly distant from the political center of power. These later continuations are especially intriguing because they appear at a time when older Anglo-Saxon elites had been displaced, raising questions about who maintained the tradition and why. Was it continuity out of habit, resistance, memory, or simply institutional inertia? Scribes continuing a practice long after its original context had faded. The manuscript evidence does not provide a single answer. Instead, it reveals variation. Different monastic centers appear to have treated the chronicle differently over time. Some versions become more localized, focusing on regional events. Others gradually incorporate broader political narratives influenced by new rulers and external authority structures. This fragmentation complicates the idea of a single authorial identity. Instead, what emerges is something closer to a chain of custodianship, each generation inheriting a text already shaped by those before them, then reshaping it again in turn. But even this model leaves something unresolved. because there are moments in the Chronicle where the writing feels unexpectedly reflective. Certain entries carry tone shifts, brief passages that suggest interpretation rather than simple record. Not commentary in the modern sense, but subtle framing that hints at perspective. Was this the voice of an individual scribe? Or the collective voice of a community internalizing how history should be understood? The question resists closure. Modern linguistic analysis has tried to map scribal differences across manuscripts, identifying patterns in spelling, phrasing, and grammatical structure. These studies suggest multiple hands, sometimes within the same manuscript tradition. But identifying a person behind those hands remains out of reach. We can trace style. We cannot fully trace identity. And this is where the mystery settles most deeply. Not in what was written, but in the fact that writing itself becomes a kind of disappearance. The more the Chronicle is preserved, the more its individual creators fade into institutional anonymity. Even the physical manuscripts contribute to this effect. Copied, recopied, and modified over centuries, they accumulate layers like sediment. Each layer preserves something, but also obscures what came before. So what remains when we try to recover the authors? Not names, not biographies, but traces of decisions, priorities, and perspectives embedded in text. Walking through surviving monastic ruins today, where scriptoria once stood quiet under stone arches and narrow windows, it is possible to imagine the rhythm of writing as a collective act rather than an individual one. Not a single chronicler shaping history alone, but many hands participating in a long continuum of record-making. And yet the question refuses to settle completely. Because somewhere within those continuations, behind the anonymity of monastic tradition, there were still individuals, people who chose words, shaped entries, and decided what would be remembered of their world. So we are left with a final uncertainty, resting between authorship and absence. Were the continuations of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle truly written by a nameless collective? Or do hidden individual voices still linger beneath the surface of the text, waiting to be distinguished if we ever learn how to listen more closely? If the silent authors of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle remind us that history can vanish behind ink and anonymity, then the next mystery shifts outward again, into open landscapes where memory was not written on fragile parchment, but carved directly into stone meant to endure wind, frost, and centuries of exposure. The ground is cold and uneven beneath ancient forests. In the northern regions of Scandinavia, across what is today Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, fields and shorelines are scattered with upright stones, some solitary, others arranged in deliberate formations. These are the Viking runestones, many of which date to around 1000 AD, at the turning point between pagan traditions and the spread of Christianity in the north. At first glance, they appear like memorials, tall slabs of granite or gneiss, carved with looping serpents, intertwined beasts, and intricate runic inscriptions that wind across the surface like coded language. Some stand near ancient roads or waterways. Others are placed beside burial mounds, bridges, or territorial boundaries. But their purpose, while broadly understood, still holds layers of uncertainty. What were they truly for? The most widely accepted explanation is commemorative. Many runestones clearly function as memorials erected in honor of deceased relatives, fathers, sons, brothers, or chieftains. Inscriptions often follow a formula. A named individual raises the stone in memory of another, sometimes describing voyages, battles, or deaths overseas. One of the most famous examples is the Jelling stones in Denmark, associated with the reign of Harald Bluetooth, which mark a pivotal moment in the Christianization of Scandinavia. These stones explicitly reference the unification of Denmark and the introduction of Christianity, blending political authority with spiritual transformation. In this sense, runestones served as public declarations of identity and memory. But this explanation only partially resolves their broader distribution and variation, because not all runestones follow the same pattern. Some contain cryptic references that resist straightforward interpretation. Others emphasize voyages to distant lands, Greece, the Middle East, the British Isles, suggesting a world of movement far beyond Scandinavia itself. A few inscriptions are unusually elaborate, invoking curses, ritual language, or symbolic imagery that extends beyond simple commemoration. So why were they erected? One interpretation suggests they functioned as territorial markers. In a landscape where political authority was often local and fluid, runestones could serve as visible claims of land ownership or familial control. Their placement near roads, bridges, and waterways supports this idea, as these were key points of movement and economic exchange. But even this explanation does not account for their symbolic complexity. Some runestones appear to encode more than names and events. The imagery of serpents, knots, and intertwined beasts may carry mythological or cosmological meaning, referencing Norse belief systems in which the world was structured through interconnected realms and symbolic forces. In this view, runestones are not merely records of individuals, but expressions of a worldview where memory, myth, and identity are inseparable. Yet questions remain. Because around 1000 AD, Scandinavia was undergoing profound transformation. Christianity was spreading through royal patronage and political consolidation, gradually replacing older religious traditions. This transition is visible on many runestones, which sometimes combine Christian crosses with traditional Norse imagery. Why merge these symbols? Some scholars suggest that runestones became tools of ideological transition. They may have been used to assert new religious identity while preserving older cultural forms. In this sense, they reflect not just memory, but negotiation between belief systems, political authority, and social continuity. But there are runestones that resist easy categorization. A number of inscriptions remain partially undeciphered, either due to weathering, unusual rune forms, or ambiguous language. Others include phrases that seem formulaic yet obscure, possibly referencing rituals or concepts that are no longer fully understood. This has led to more speculative interpretations. Some researchers have suggested that certain runestones may have functioned as navigational markers for seafarers, encoding information about routes, hazards, or coastal landmarks. Given the maritime nature of Viking society, this is not implausible, though direct evidence remains limited. Others propose that some stones may have had legal or judicial functions, marking agreements, disputes, or public declarations of law in a society where oral tradition played a central role in governance. In this view, runestones are not static memorials, but active instruments of social order. Still, neither interpretation fully explains the diversity of their forms. Why do some stones emphasize voyages across vast distances, while others remain deeply local? Why do certain inscriptions appear highly standardized, while others are highly individualized or symbolic? And why were these monuments concentrated in particular periods, especially around the transition to Christianity? Archaeological context provides some clues. Runestones often appear in regions of economic importance, trade routes, assembly sites, and coastal zones connected to long-distance travel. Their placement suggests visibility and communication. They were meant to be seen, read, and encountered in public space. But what exactly they communicated may have shifted depending on audience. To one observer, a runestone might be a memorial. To another, a claim of inheritance. To another still, a declaration of faith or political allegiance. This layered meaning complicates any single interpretation. And then there is the question of memory itself. Unlike written chronicles preserved in monastic libraries, Rune stones are public, permanent, and exposed. They do not circulate. They stand. Their audience is anyone who passes by, travelers, locals, enemies, descendants. In this sense, they are not just records of the dead, but messages directed at the living across time. Yet even permanence has limits. Many rune stones have been moved, damaged, or lost over the centuries. Others survive only through later drawings or references in antiquarian records. The landscape that once gave them context has changed, sometimes dramatically. And so we are left with fragments of a once visible system of meaning. Standing among these stones today, under shifting northern light, one encounters a silence that is not empty, but structured, shaped by carved lines, looping runes, and figures that still watch from stone surfaces worn by time. The inscriptions remain, but their full intention does not always yield itself easily. So the question lingers, as persistent as the carvings themselves. Were Viking runestones primarily memorials of the dead, markers of land and power, tools of religious transition, or something more complex still, combining all of these roles into a single carved language that we are only partially able to read today? If the Viking runestones leave us with layered meanings carved into stone, then the mystery deepens when we look beyond what they explicitly say, and focus instead on what they seem to assume their viewers already understood. The wind still moves across the northern landscapes. Heather-covered fields, rocky shorelines, and forest edges hold these stones in place like silent witnesses. Some are broken. Others lean slightly, as if time itself has shifted their posture. And yet their inscriptions remain, etched into surfaces that were never meant to be temporary. Among the Viking runestones, scholars have long noticed something subtle but important. The messages are rarely explanatory in a modern sense. They do not teach a system. They do not define their symbols. They assume familiarity. This raises an unsettling question. Who exactly were they speaking to? The most common interpretation remains commemorative and public. A family honors a dead relative. A chieftain marks a voyage. A community records presence, lineage, or achievement. In this reading, runestones function like open-air announcements, visible statements placed where people naturally gathered or passed. But even within this framework, ambiguity persists, because many inscriptions refer to journeys far beyond Scandinavia, naming distant lands and encounters. Some mention the British Isles, others the Eastern Mediterranean, and a few even reference regions associated with the Byzantine world and Islamic territories. These references suggest a cultural horizon far wider than the immediate landscape of the stones themselves. So were runestones simply memorials of local life, or records of a far more interconnected world? One mainstream explanation is that Viking society was deeply maritime, with mobility as a defining feature. Travel was not exceptional. It was expected. Raiding, trading, serving as mercenaries, and exploration formed part of a shared cultural experience. In this sense, the stones may reflect a society constantly in motion, where distant journeys were not extraordinary but ordinary markers of life. Yet that still does not fully explain their form. Some inscriptions appear to encode social status rather than narrative detail. Names are repeated, titles are emphasized, lineage is carefully traced. This suggests that runestones were not only about remembering the dead, but also about reinforcing identity among the living. In a society without centralized written bureaucracy, such markers may have served as public validation of status claims. But then there are stones that complicate even this interpretation. Certain inscriptions include unusually poetic or symbolic language, sometimes invoking mythological imagery or ritualized phrasing. These elements hint at a cultural layer where meaning was not purely informational, but also performative. Were these stones simply records, or were they part of ritual expression? The transition period around 1000 AD adds another layer of complexity. This was a time when Scandinavia was undergoing religious transformation. Christianity was spreading through royal influence, trade contact, and political consolidation. Yet older belief systems did not disappear immediately. Instead, they appear to have coexisted, overlapped, and sometimes merged. Some runestones reflect this transition directly, combining Christian crosses with traditional Norse artistic motifs. This blending raises a difficult question. Were runestones adapting to new beliefs, or preserving older ones within a changing symbolic language? The answer may not be singular. Different regions appear to have responded differently to cultural change. In some areas, Christian symbolism becomes dominant. In others, traditional imagery persists longer. This uneven distribution suggests that runestones were not governed by a single unified purpose, but by local decisions shaped by overlapping influences. And yet, even in their diversity, they share one consistent feature: visibility. These were not hidden texts. They were not private records. They were placed in public space, by roads, bridges, assembly fields, and coastal routes. Their audience was broad, but also undefined. Anyone passing by could, in theory, encounter them, which leads to a more subtle mystery. If runestones were meant to be read publicly, how widely was their meaning actually understood? Runic literacy was not universal. It was likely concentrated among certain groups, skilled carvers, elites, and individuals involved in trade or governance. This suggests that many viewers may have recognized the stones as significant without fully decoding their inscriptions. In that case, the stones may have functioned as symbols of authority rather than fully transparent messages. A carved runestone could communicate power even without being read in detail. Some researchers have proposed that this symbolic visibility was itself the primary function. The presence of a runestone signaled control over land, memory, and lineage. The exact wording mattered less than the act of inscription itself. But even this interpretation leaves gaps. Because certain stones appear to carry unusually specific references, names, places, and events that suggest intended communication rather than purely symbolic display. This tension between symbolic presence and literal message is part of what makes runestones so difficult to classify. They seem to operate on multiple levels at once: memorial, marker, statement, ritual object, historical record, and possibly more than we can reconstruct. Modern archaeological surveys continue to discover runestones in unexpected contexts, sometimes reused in later construction, sometimes buried, sometimes fragmented. Each discovery adds data, but also complicates the broader picture, because the more stones we find, the more variation we see, and variation resists simplification. Standing before these stones today, one is struck not only by what is carved into them, but by what they assume about the world they once inhabited. A world where travel was constant, identity was publicly asserted, and memory was physically anchored in landscape. But also a world where not all meaning was written down. Some of it may have been spoken, some remembered, some understood only within the communities that created them. So the question remains open, etched as deeply as the runes themselves. Were Viking runestones designed primarily to communicate specific messages across time, or were they meant to signal something broader, identity, presence, and belonging, in a world where meaning was shared as much through recognition as through reading? If the Viking runestones leave us with layered meanings carved into stone, then the mystery deepens when we look beyond what they explicitly say, and focus instead on what they seem to assume their viewers already understood. The wind still moves across the northern landscapes. Heather-covered fields, rocky shorelines, and forest edges hold these stones in place like silent witnesses. Some are broken, others lean slightly, as if time itself has shifted their posture. And yet their inscriptions remain, etched into surfaces that were never meant to be temporary. Among the Viking runestones, scholars have long noticed something subtle but important. The messages are rarely explanatory in a modern sense. They do not teach a system. They do not define their symbols. They assume familiarity. This raises an unsettling question. Who exactly were they speaking to? The most common interpretation remains commemorative and public. A family honors a dead relative. A chieftain marks a voyage. A community records presence, lineage, or achievement. In this reading, runestones function like open-air announcements, visible statements placed where people naturally gathered or passed. But even within this framework, ambiguity persists, because many inscriptions refer to journeys far beyond Scandinavia, naming distant lands and encounters. Some mention the British Isles, others the Eastern Mediterranean, and a few even reference regions associated with the Byzantine world and Islamic territories. These references suggest a cultural horizon far wider than the immediate landscape of the stones themselves. So were runestones simply memorials of local life, or records of a far more interconnected world? One mainstream explanation is that Viking society was deeply maritime, with mobility as a defining feature. Travel was not exceptional, it was expected. Raiding, trading, serving as mercenaries, and exploration formed part of a shared cultural experience. In this sense, the stones may reflect a society constantly in motion, where distant journeys were not extraordinary, but ordinary markers of life. Yet that still does not fully explain their form. Some inscriptions appear to encode social status rather than narrative detail. Names are repeated, titles are emphasized, lineage is carefully traced. This suggests that runestones were not only about remembering the dead, but also about reinforcing identity among the living. In a society without centralized written bureaucracy, such markers may have served as public validation of status claims. But then there are stones that complicate even this interpretation. Certain inscriptions include unusually poetic or symbolic language, sometimes invoking mythological imagery or ritualized phrasing. These elements hint at a cultural layer where meaning was not purely informational, but also performative. Were these stones simply records, or were they part of ritual expression? The transition period around 1000 AD adds another layer of complexity. This was a time when Scandinavia was undergoing religious transformation. Christianity was spreading through royal influence, trade contact, and political consolidation. Yet older belief systems did not disappear immediately. Instead, they appear to have coexisted, overlapped, and sometimes merged. Some runestones reflect this transition directly, combining Christian crosses with traditional Norse artistic motifs. This blending raises a difficult question. Were runestones adapting to new beliefs, or preserving older ones within a changing symbolic language? The answer may not be singular. Different regions appear to have responded differently to cultural change. In some areas, Christian symbolism becomes dominant. In others, traditional imagery persists longer. This uneven distribution suggests that runestones were not governed by a single unified purpose, but by local decisions shaped by overlapping influences. And yet, even in their diversity, they share one consistent feature: visibility. These were not hidden texts. They were not private records. They were placed in public space, by roads, bridges, assembly fields, and coastal routes. Their audience was broad, but also undefined. Anyone passing by could, in theory, encounter them. Which leads to a more subtle mystery. If runestones were meant to be read publicly, how widely was their meaning actually understood? Runic literacy was not universal. It was likely concentrated among certain groups, skilled carvers, elites, and individuals involved in trade or governance. This suggests that many viewers may have recognized the stones as significant without fully decoding their inscriptions. In that case, the stones may have functioned as symbols of authority rather than fully transparent messages. A carved rune stone could communicate power even without being read in detail. Some researchers have proposed that this symbolic visibility was itself the primary function. The presence of a rune stone signaled control over land, memory, and lineage. The exact wording mattered less than the act of inscription itself. But even this interpretation leaves gaps, because certain stones appear to carry unusually specific references, names, places, and events that suggest intended communication rather than purely symbolic display. This tension between symbolic presence and literal message is part of what makes runestones so difficult to classify. They seem to operate on multiple levels at once: memorial, marker, statement, ritual object, historical record, and possibly more than we can reconstruct. Modern archaeological surveys continue to discover runestones in unexpected contexts, sometimes reused in later construction, sometimes buried, sometimes fragmented. Each discovery adds data, but also complicates the broader picture, because the more stones we find, the more variation we see, and variation resists simplification. Standing before these stones today, one is struck not only by what is carved into them, but by what they assume about the world they once inhabited. A world where travel was constant, identity was publicly asserted, and memory was physically anchored in landscape. But also a world where not all meaning was written down. Some of it may have been spoken, some remembered, some understood only within the communities that created them. So the question remains open, etched as deeply as the runes themselves. Were Viking runestones designed primarily to communicate specific messages across time? Or were they meant to signal something broader, identity, presence, and belonging, in a world where meaning was shared as much through recognition as through reading? If the hidden movements of Templar wealth reveal how systems can dissolve into shadow, then the next mystery shifts away from Europe entirely and into the cold, shifting margins of the North Atlantic, where land itself becomes uncertain and exploration slips between history and possibility. The ocean is never empty here. Gray water stretches toward a horizon that seems to erase direction itself. Ice drifts slowly through currents shaped by wind older than memory. Somewhere beyond these waters lies Greenland, where Norse settlers once built small communities on the edge of a fragile world. And further still, beyond established settlement boundaries, there are hints, scattered and incomplete, of journeys that may have gone farther than certainty allows. The historical anchor for this entire narrative is the expansion of Norse seafarers from Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Among them, the most widely accepted figure associated with Western exploration is Leif Erikson. According to the Icelandic sagas, Leif Erikson and his contemporaries reached lands west of Greenland, naming them Vinland. Archaeological evidence at Lanso Meadows confirms Norse presence in North America around 1000 AD, making it the earliest widely accepted transatlantic European contact. But this confirmed site may not represent the full extent of Norse exploration. The question that follows naturally is unsettling in its simplicity. Did they go further? The mainstream interpretation holds that Norse voyages beyond Greenland and Vinland were limited and episodic. Navigation was difficult, resources were constrained, settlements were small and vulnerable. It is therefore likely, many scholars argue, that exploration did not extend far beyond the regions now confirmed archaeologically. Yet the sagas tell a more expansive story. In the Icelandic narrative traditions, Vinland is described as a place of abundance, timber, grapes, and mild conditions compared to Greenland's harsher environment. These accounts, recorded centuries after the events they describe, blend memory, oral tradition, and literary shaping. They are not straightforward historical documents, but neither are they easily dismissed. and within them, hints appear of journeys that may have extended beyond what is physically verified. Some interpretations suggest that Norse explorers may have reached multiple coastal points in North America, possibly traveling further south or inland than the archaeological record currently confirms. Others propose that seasonal voyages, rather than permanent settlements, could have extended exploration over wider distances without leaving substantial material traces. But archaeology is cautious. So far, only a small number of Norse sites in North America have been confirmed with certainty, and all cluster within a relatively limited geographic range. Beyond these, evidence becomes fragmented, ambiguous, or open to competing interpretations. Still, absence is not always absence. It can also be invisibility caused by time, environment, and material decay. Wood structures rot. Temporary camps leave little trace. Coastal erosion reshapes shorelines over centuries. What may have existed for a season could disappear entirely from the archaeological record. This creates space for uncertainty, and uncertainty, in turn, invites speculation. Some fringe interpretations propose that Norse navigation knowledge may have been more extensive than surviving evidence suggests, potentially allowing for repeated exploratory voyages along the North Atlantic coastlines. These ideas often draw on interpretations of sailing routes, currents, and seasonal winds, suggesting that experienced seafarers could have traveled farther with relative efficiency. However, no definitive material evidence confirms sustained exploration beyond the known sites. What remains instead is a pattern of possibility. The sagas speak in fragments, named places, descriptive landscapes, encounters with unfamiliar peoples. Yet translating these descriptions into modern geography is complex. Names may have shifted. Stories may have been adapted. Oral tradition can preserve memory, but it also transforms it. So when the sagas describe distant lands, we are left asking, are we reading geography or narrative geography shaped by memory and storytelling? The Norse world itself was deeply maritime. Travel between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and surrounding regions was not exceptional. It was structural. Movement was part of life, economy, and identity. Ships were not only vessels of exploration, but of communication and survival. In that context, the idea of limited exploration may seem less definitive than it first appears. But again, evidence governs certainty, and evidence is uneven. Some researchers point to environmental factors that could have encouraged wider exploration, such as drifting timber, animal migration patterns, or reports of land sightings carried by currents and storms. These natural forces may have shaped navigational curiosity, prompting voyages that were never fully recorded. Yet without physical confirmation, these remain interpretive possibilities rather than established history. And so the narrative settles into tension between confirmed settlement and suggested exploration, between archaeological certainty and literary tradition, between what was left behind in stone and what may have been carried only in memory. Even the confirmed site at Lonso Meadows raises its own questions. Was it a single expedition's endpoint, a temporary base, a seasonal outpost used repeatedly over time, or part of a larger network of intermittent exploration that has not yet fully surfaced in the archaeological record? Each interpretation shifts the boundaries of what known settlement actually means. And as those boundaries shift, so does the mystery. Because the further we move from confirmed sites, the more we rely on indirect traces, linguistic echoes, environmental inference, and narrative fragments preserved in later sources. Which leads back to the central uncertainty. If Norse explorers did travel beyond the limits we currently recognize, they left behind very little that survives clearly enough to map their full range. And if they did not, why do the sagas describe a world so much larger than what archaeology has yet confirmed? The answer may lie somewhere between movement and memory, between voyages that were real and the ways those voyages were later remembered, reshaped, and retold across generations. So the question remains open, carried like wind across the Atlantic itself. Did early Norse exploration extend far beyond the settlements we know today? Or are we still reading only the faintest surviving edges of journeys that once reached much farther into the unknown? If the Viking runestones reveal how entire cultures can encode identity into stone, then the next mystery shifts from open landscapes into enclosed stone walls, where secrecy was not incidental, but foundational. Here, silence was not just an absence of sound, but a structure of power. The stone corridors are cold, even in memory. In the early 12th century AD, beneath the vaulted ceilings of monastic halls and newly established commanderies across Europe and the Levant, a military order emerged that would become one of the most influential and enigmatic institutions of the medieval world. Known as the Knights Templar, they were entrusted with both martial responsibility and spiritual authority. Their rise was rapid. Founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade, the Templars quickly gained favor from religious authorities and European monarchs. They were granted land, exemptions from taxation, and unusual autonomy for a military order. Over time, they developed a sophisticated financial network that stretched across Europe and into the eastern Mediterranean. And with that network came a question that would echo long after their downfall. What happened to their treasure? At the height of their influence, the Templars controlled vast resources. Donations from nobles, profits from estates, revenues from banking operations, and spoils associated with crusading campaigns all flowed into their system. They operated fortifications, ports, farms, and financial houses that connected distant regions into a single logistical structure. Yet when the order was dismantled in the early 14th century, much of this wealth seemed to vanish. The most widely accepted historical account describes a dramatic collapse initiated by political pressure. In 1307 AD, under orders from King Philip IV of France, Templar members were arrested across France, accused of heresy, and subjected to trials that led to the dissolution of the order by papal decree. Their property was officially transferred to other institutions. But what of their accumulated wealth before and beyond that point? Some assets were indeed accounted for. Lands were redistributed. Treasuries were absorbed by royal authorities or rival orders. But contemporaneous records leave gaps, especially regarding liquid wealth, movable assets, and funds managed through their broader European network. And it is within these gaps that the mystery persists. One mainstream interpretation suggests that the idea of a single centralized Templar treasure may be misleading. Instead, their wealth was likely distributed across multiple commanderies, financial nodes, and regional depots. When the order was dissolved, these assets would have been fragmented, absorbed locally, or seized by competing powers. In this view, nothing truly disappeared. It was simply dispersed. But even this explanation does not fully account for certain historical anomalies. Contemporary accounts suggest that key leaders of the order were forewarned or had time to act before arrests were fully enforced. Some records indicate that on the night before the crackdown in France, certain Templar holdings may have been emptied or relocated under uncertain circumstances. What was moved and where it went remains unclear. This has led to more speculative interpretations. One long-standing tradition suggests that portions of Templar wealth were secretly transported away from mainland Europe before or during the suppression of the order. Some theories propose movement through Atlantic ports, potentially toward regions outside immediate royal control. Others suggest that wealth was hidden within existing ecclesiastical networks or absorbed into sympathetic institutions. However, no definitive archaeological evidence has confirmed a single unified relocation. Still, the idea of concealment persists. Part of this persistence comes from the structure of the Templar organization itself. Unlike many medieval groups, the Templars developed highly organized administrative and financial systems. They issued letters of credit, managed cross-regional transactions, and maintained communication across vast distances. This level of sophistication raises a difficult question. If their wealth was so systematically managed, could it also have been systematically hidden? Some researchers argue that the answer may lie not in a single cache, but in decentralization. Wealth may have been converted into land, obligations, or intangible assets that were harder to confiscate. In this sense, the treasure of the Templars might not have been gold or silver alone, but a network of financial relationships that survived even after the order itself was destroyed. Yet legends tell a different story. Over centuries, tales emerged of hidden vaults, secret fleets, and buried caches of immense wealth guarded by surviving members or dispersed successors. These stories, while lacking direct documentary confirmation, reflect the enduring cultural impact of the Templar disappearance. Some traditions associate their treasure with remote castles or underground chambers. Others connect it to symbolic objects of religious significance. Still others suggest that knowledge itself, maps, documents, or esoteric teachings, may have been considered part of their treasure. But separating metaphor from material history is difficult. Archaeology has uncovered Templar sites across Europe and the Middle East, including fortified commanderies, agricultural estates, and coastal structures. These sites reveal organizational strength, but not a single unified treasury. Instead, what emerges is a picture of distributed power and distributed wealth, which may be precisely why the mystery persists. Because in a decentralized system, disappearance is rarely absolute. It becomes transformation. Assets become absorbed. Records become fragmented. Networks dissolve into other institutions. Over time, what was once identifiable as a single organization becomes indistinguishable from the broader structures that replaced it. Still, certain questions remain unresolved. Why do some financial records abruptly end in specific regions during the period of suppression? Why do later medieval accounts continue to reference Templar wealth in vague or symbolic terms? And why did the idea of a hidden treasure persist so strongly in cultural memory long after the order itself had vanished? These are not questions that yield simple answers. They sit at the intersection of documented history and inherited narrative. Standing within the ruins of former Templar sites today, stone halls now open to weather and time, it is possible to imagine the flow of goods, letters, and people that once moved through these spaces. The order was not static. It was mobile, interconnected, and adaptive, which makes its disappearance all the more complex. Because what was dissolved was not just property, but an entire system of coordination, and systems rarely vanish cleanly. So the question remains suspended in the echo of empty halls and fragmented records. Did the treasure of the early Knights Templar truly vanish in a moment of historical suppression, or was it gradually absorbed into the hidden architecture of medieval Europe, its wealth transformed, redistributed, and disguised within institutions that outlived the order itself? If the scattered legacy of the Knights Templar hints at wealth dissolving into institutions and time, the mystery deepens when attention turns from their European commanderies to the edges of their world, where land, faith, and uncertainty met in places far harder to control or record. The sea routes are never still. From the harbors of medieval Europe to the eastern Mediterranean, ships once carried not only pilgrims and soldiers, but also letters, goods, and the invisible machinery of finance that sustained the Knights Templar. Their network extended into ports, fortified towns, and sacred landscapes shaped by decades of crusading movement. And within that vast system, some routes were better documented than others. Others fade quickly into silence. When the order was suppressed in the early 14th century AD, attention focused heavily on France and parts of Western Europe. Yet the Templars were never confined to a single kingdom. Their presence in the Levant, Iberia, and Mediterranean islands meant that parts of their network operated in regions where political authority was fragmented and records were uneven. So, what became of assets located far from the centers of confiscation? The most conservative historical view suggests that any remaining Templar holdings in distant territories were gradually absorbed by local rulers or transferred to successor institutions. In many cases, this would have occurred quietly, without dramatic seizure or public accounting. Over time, properties changed hands, and financial trails disappeared into routine administration. But even this measured explanation leaves open gaps. Because the Templars did not operate like ordinary landowners. Their system was structured, interconnected, and unusually mobile for its time. Resources were not always tied to fixed estates. Instead, they could move through credit, obligation, and trust networks that crossed political boundaries, which makes tracing their final distribution unusually difficult. Some medieval records suggest that in the years leading up to the arrests of 1307 AD, certain Templar commanders may have relocated assets from vulnerable regions. Whether this was precaution, routine management, or response to political tension is unclear. The documentation is fragmentary, and later accounts often blend observation with legend. And this is where history begins to blur into narrative. In some later traditions, especially those preserved in regional folklore, there are references to ships departing under unusual circumstances, carrying unknown cargo. These stories vary widely in detail and reliability, but they consistently reflect a shared idea that something important was moved away before the Order's collapse became fully irreversible. Mainstream scholarship treats such accounts cautiously, noting the lack of corroborating contemporary evidence. Yet the persistence of these stories raises another question. Why did the idea of hidden relocation become so enduring? One possible answer lies in the structure of the Templar financial system itself. The Order pioneered forms of early banking that allowed funds to be transferred without physical movement of coin. Pilgrims could deposit wealth in one region and withdraw equivalent value elsewhere. This system depended on trust, documentation, and cross-regional recognition. But it also created opacity, because value was not always tied to physical treasure, but to recorded obligation. So, when suppression occurred, what exactly was being destroyed? Physical assets could be seized, land could be reassigned, but the underlying network of credit and obligation was far harder to dismantle cleanly. In some regions, Templar-associated financial practices appear to have been absorbed into emerging banking systems, especially in parts of Italy and southern France. This suggests continuity rather than disappearance. Still, continuity is not the same as visibility, and visibility is what history often demands in order to confirm survival. Some speculative interpretations propose that parts of the Templar network may have intentionally dissolved into other organizations, blending into existing religious and commercial structures to avoid total eradication. In this view, their treasure was not hidden in vaults, but diffused into systems that continued operating under different names. However, no direct documentary evidence confirms a coordinated global concealment strategy. What remains instead is suggestion, patterns without full explanation. Archaeological investigations of former Templar sites occasionally uncover storage facilities, fortified rooms, and administrative spaces that hint at organized resource management. Yet these findings rarely include large caches of wealth or definitive proof of sudden removal. Absence becomes part of the puzzle, because if wealth had been seized abruptly and centrally, one might expect clearer traces of confiscation in financial records across multiple regions. Instead, what appears is uneven. Some assets accounted for, others transferred, and many left ambiguous. This unevenness complicates any single narrative of loss. It suggests that the end of the Templars was not a single event, but a staggered process unfolding differently across regions. And in staggered processes, clarity often dissolves. There is also the question of timing. The suppression of the order was swift in France, but its enforcement varied elsewhere. In some territories, actions against Templar properties were delayed, negotiated, or partially resisted. During these intervals, opportunities for redistribution or relocation would have existed. But opportunity does not confirm action. It only allows for possibility. And possibility is where mystery takes root. Over centuries, the idea of a hidden Templar treasure expanded beyond administrative history into cultural memory. Stories of lost fleets, secret vaults, and concealed hoards became part of a broader tradition of medieval enigmas. These narratives often reflect symbolic meaning as much as historical speculation, representing themes of loss, secrecy, and survival. Yet beneath the symbolism lies a more grounded uncertainty. Because even stripped of legend, the historical record does not fully account for every asset, every transfer, every endpoint. Some trails simply fade. And so the question returns, reshaped but unresolved. If the wealth of the early Knights Templar was not lost in a single moment of confiscation, but gradually dispersed across regions, institutions, and systems, then where does their story truly end? And where does it continue, hidden not in buried treasure, but in the unseen structures of medieval power that outlived them?